Chapter 8. Why do white people love Mandela? Why do conservatives hate Castro? The crushing defeat of the racist army at Quito Carnavale was a victory for the whole of Africa. The decisive defeat of the apartheid aggressors broke the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressors. The defeat of the apartheid army was an inspiration to the struggling people inside South Africa. Without the defeat of Quito Carnavale, our organizations would not have been unbanned. The defeat of the racist army at Quito Carnavale made it possible for me to be here today. Nelson Mandela, 26th of July, 1991, speaking in Matanzas, Cuba. The boy pulled at his dead mother's sleeve. Her white shirt caked with dust and blood. She lay on the ground, frozen. Mangled limbs fixed in the patterns of a falling runner. The boy cried and pulled and even nestled himself affectionately under his mother's armpit. But she was still dead. Around them, stretched over the grass and dirt, lay mothers, fathers, and children, scattered, bleeding, dead, or dying. Just moments earlier, the sound of song could be heard, but the brutal crack of bullets had left in its wake only silence punctured by screams. This scene from the 1987 film Mandela, starring Danny Glover, was my first introduction to the brutal reality of apartheid. I'm pretty sure I watched the film not long after it came out, which would have made me just 4 or 5 years old. In all the years since then, I have not watched it again. Yet that scene, which depicted the notorious Sharpeville massacre of 1960, in which 69 people were shot dead, scores injured, and many paralyzed by bullets in their backs as they fled, has stayed with me as if I watched it yesterday. Thousands of black South Africans had gathered at the police station in Sharpeville to protest the racist pass laws of the South African government. They were unarmed, but this did not stop the police from deciding to massacre them. The film recreated these events in fairly brutal and graphic detail. This was the first time I'd ever had to think about how cheap human life, and particularly black human life, could be. I watched this film with my mother, stepfather, and older sister. As you may have noticed by now, my family home was very politicized. The anti-apartheid struggle was the first political issue I recall entering my life. The African National Congress, ANC, Freedom Charter was on the wall in our house, along with the Malcolm X By Any Means Necessary poster. Even though South Africa was thousands of miles away, the black British community was heavily involved in anti-apartheid campaigning and organizing. Anti-apartheid activists saw clearly the relationship between the British state's support for a foreign, racist settler colony and its domestic racism. After all, can it really be a complete coincidence that the most tumultuous decade of Britain's domestic race relations history was also the decade of the apex of the struggle against apartheid? As I have mentioned, my Pan-African Saturday School was named after Winnie Mandela in honor of her contribution to that very struggle and in recognition of an internationalist understanding of white supremacy and colonialism. I grew up watching Mama Winnie appear on television in the years approaching Nelson's release from prison, and my family went on many anti-apartheid demonstrations. I saw a brilliant production of the South African play Sarafina at the Hackney Empire several times during 1991. The play depicted the Soweto uprisings of 1976 and featured the legendary South African jazz musician Hugh Masekela, who I got to meet. As you can imagine, within this cultural and political environment, I had already got a sense of the incredible brutality of imperialism and white supremacy long before my 10th birthday. You could question the wisdom of allowing a 5-year-old to watch a film clearly designed for an adult audience, and I certainly remember feeling disturbed and upset. But even now, I remember watching that scene as a turning point in my life. The moment at which I first realized adults could be so horrible and that the world was well and truly messed up. You could criticize my parents for playing me something so brutal at such an age, but I think that would be a mistake. The reality is, most children in the world do not have the luxury of hiding from the brutalities of systemic injustice, and as tough as my upbringing may have been by British standards, there are certainly more children on the planet, even now, whose lives more closely resemble the lives of a child born in Soweto or Sharpeville than one born in Camden. I think my parents did the right thing. Even though it was painful and confusing, and it left me with so many questions that I could not properly formulate. Mummy, if the police are supposed to protect people, why are they shooting them? Why are all the police white and all the people protesting black? But they were only singing. Why did they kill them? What is going to happen to that little boy now his mother is dead? Mummy? If the overriding white nationalism of Anglo-American governments is to be fully understood, then we need look no further than the issue of apartheid South Africa. Decades after the supposed war against fascism, the British and American governments and the capital they served could be found supporting a regime whose ideas were rooted in the same kind of genocidal racial logic as the Nazis. The governments of Britain and the US, who had styled themselves as the world's policemen and who had invaded numerous countries on apparently humanitarian grounds, would obviously not be invading South Africa, perhaps the most universally unpopular regime of the late 20th century. No, they would in fact support it. While Margaret Thatcher claimed to be against apartheid on principle, she consistently opposed sanctions against the regime. Westminster, Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill had played crucial roles in constructing apartheid in the first place, despite the number of black South Africans that had fought on the British side in the Boer War and would fight for them again during the Second World War, the war to end fascism. Remember? It is inconceivable that if the race roles in South Africa had been reversed, Britain and the US would have supported a black government committing such outrages on its white population. Britain, France, and the USA had consistently blocked calls from the international community to impose an arms embargo on South Africa, even after the murder of school children and the banning of opposition political parties and groups. This is usually what the great powers call supporting democracy abroad. To think this kind of naked support of a government who believed black people to be subhuman would not have an effect on the domestic black population is obviously totally ludicrous. But successive British governments either did not care or were willing to manage the contradiction. As you've already seen, we were very much still second-class citizens in the 1980s. Black Britons, for reasons that should be abundantly obvious, were overwhelmingly against apartheid, though the situation in southern Africa was much more complex than one struggle. The divisions of ethnicity, traditional nobility, and actually potentially having to run a country all complicated matters and divided loyalties. I also appreciate that it's easy to be radical from thousands of miles away when the boot is not on your neck and the bayonet is not in your back. Nonetheless, anti-apartheid was an issue around which the vast majority of black Brits were united, which is what made Frank Bruno's tacit support all the more galling. It's also worth remembering that Jamaica and Barbados were the first countries to impose sanctions on the apartheid regime, and naturally that stand filtered down to Caribbean descendants in the UK. Across Britain more widely, hundreds of thousands of people participated in marches and demonstrations against apartheid. High-profile artists recorded tribute songs and lent voices of support to enforce a cultural boycott of South Africa. And the concert at Wembley Stadium in honour of Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday that called for his release from prison was graced by some of the biggest music stars from across the globe. From 1986 to 1990, activists in the UK organised a non-stop picket outside the South African embassy in London. The response of the state was to arrest activists and try to ban the protest. Think about that. The British government having its own citizens arrested for protesting a foreign racist settler regime. It seems that large sections of the British public have long been more forward-thinking than those in power. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, it was a momentous occasion for us. The iconic photo of Nelson and Winnie with their black power fists in the air graced the covers of newspapers the world over. The Voice, Britain's most popular black newspaper at the time, ran the photo with the headline, "Free at Last," in obvious reference to Martin Luther King Jr. The Daily Telegraph, on the other hand, ran the headline, "Armed Struggle Will Go On," says Mandela. A very misleading headline, given that the internationally backed apartheid regime and their black collaborators were still massacring ANC members and supporters, and that apartheid itself had been rooted in grotesque violence. Now that Mandela's ANC has become the ruling party in South Africa, it is easy to forget just how precarious things were back then, even after Mandela's release. Soon after his release, a second concert was held at Wembley Stadium, and Mandela graced the stage to address the world. In my family home, at the Hackney Empire, and across the black British community and anti-racist activist circles, the mood was one of celebration and victory. While the more cynical and astute among the adults knew even then that justice would not really be served, that those who had committed decades of atrocities under the apartheid regime would not be punished. Nobody questioned that this was a significant moment, that the powers that be had been forced to compromise, and that the last white settler regime in Africa had been formally defeated. In later years, my connection to the struggle became more personal. One of my school friends was living in the UK in exile after his father had been killed by the apartheid regime. In our secondary school hip-hop group, he rapped, "To me, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission seems insane, since lies and suffering is all we seem to obtain." Even a teenager could see that truth and reconciliation were not justice. From his release from prison until his death, Mandela became a virtual saint in the mainstream media, an elder uncle to our broken world, praised by everyone from Bill Clinton to the Pope. When Mandela died, the Daily Mail ran with the headline, "Death of a Colossus." Downing Street flew the flag at half-mast, and then Prime Minister David Cameron called Mandela a true global hero. Statues of Mandela now stand outside the South Bank Centre and even in Parliament Square, along with two of the architects of apartheid, Winston Churchill and Jan Smuts. How is this possible, you might legitimately ask? How can people that love the makers of apartheid also love the breakers of it? Surely something must be amiss here. Why did the opinion of the white conservative mainstream and respectable liberals suddenly come to view Nelson Mandela as a hero at some unknown point in 1989? Remember, sections of the British press had accused the ANC of wanting to establish a communist-style black dictatorship in South Africa. Margaret Thatcher had labelled the ANC a typical terrorist organisation. It was recognised as such in the USA until 2008. And opposed sanctions, and the Federation of Conservative Students ran a Hang Mandela campaign. While there is no evidence that a young David Cameron participated in the Hang Mandela campaign, he certainly did travel to South Africa in 1989 on a fact-finding mission paid for by a lobbying group that sought to lift sanctions. So why all the Mandela love post-1990 from people that were at best ambivalent to black South African life at any point before then, and at worst, openly hostile to it? I know why I love and respect Madiba, and I know why my community and people that were anti-apartheid before it was fashionable do. We love Madiba because he risked his life and lost his freedom for 27 years for opposing one of the most unjust regimes in history. We love him because even when he was offered his freedom in 1985 in return for a capitulation to apartheid, Madiba refused, telling the South African people that his freedom was inseparable from their freedom. And yes, we love Madiba because he had the courage to take up arms against a morally indefensible racist settler colony. We also love Mandela because, even once he was released, he never forgot those countries that had supported his long struggle, no matter how unpopular their leaders became in the mainstream press. But what about all the newfound Mandela worshippers? Why did they suddenly love Madiba? Was it that the white mainstream had suddenly come alive to the evils of white supremacy and, in a moment of moral epiphany, much like the manner in which they ended slavery, had discovered that Mandela's struggle was a just one? Were they suddenly committed to the Freedom Charter? Did they wish to see the wealth of South Africa even mildly redistributed? Are those that belatedly learned to love Mandela committed to trying to eradicate the things for which Mandela lost 27 years of his brilliant life? Or are their motivations rather more sinister? We can glean some insight by contrasting how these same organs of the press and political institutions have chosen to remember or depict another man and country of whom Mandela was a great admirer: Castro and Cuba. Somehow, these belated anti-apartheid types have either forgotten or do not know that the only non-African nation to send its troops to actually fight the apartheid regime was Cuba. Not only that, but Cuba provided medical aid and military training to the ANC in exile. Cuba's role in helping to bring an end to formal apartheid in Africa was decisive, and Mandela, until the end of his long life, never forgot it. He once wrote that the Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom and justice unparalleled for its principled and selfless character. The first foreign country Mandela visited upon release from prison was Cuba, where he met and shared a podium with Fidel Castro, a man he referred to as my brother and my president. So, how is it possible that Mandela's newfound white conservative fan club came to such different conclusions about Castro and Cuba than Mandela himself did? To understand, we must visit the history of how apartheid actually ended, because like all achievements of black freedom before it, the fall of apartheid seems to be remembered as a gift from newly enlightened rulers and liberal campaigners putting pressure on odious regimes. This could not be further from the actual truth. In 1974, the dictatorship that had governed Portugal collapsed under pressure from the Carnation Revolution, and the new leftist government stopped the military actions of the previous regime in Portugal's African colonies of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. These free territories were the last vestiges of direct European colonial rule in Africa, and all three countries had already been undergoing military struggles against Portuguese rule, supported by Cuba and, to a much lesser and more ambiguous extent, the Soviet Union. With the change in government in Portugal and independence declared in Angola, a new set of problems arose that would play a key role in ending apartheid. Angola had declared itself independent under the leadership of Agostinho Neto's leftist MPLA, a movement that was openly hostile to South African apartheid and had links with the ANC. In response, the apartheid regime invaded Angola. They had already been occupying neighbouring Namibia for almost a decade, imprisoning and torturing children as they had in South Africa itself. In response to requests from the Angolan government, 36,000 Cuban troops deployed into Angola between 1975 and 1976 to assist in the struggle against the racist regime in Pretoria. For all the bravery of the MPLA and SWAPO, the Namibian Liberation Movement, it is entirely inconceivable that they would have won without this Cuban contingent, a contingent in which Afro-Cubans had a significant presence. Or at least that's what the African revolutionaries themselves maintain. Up until 1987, the apartheid regime made repeated encroaches into Angola and armed a brutal and unscrupulous proxy leader named Jonas Savimbi of UNITA to try and overthrow the Angolan government. However, at the crucial Battle of Quito Carnavale, referred to by Mandela in the epigraph of this chapter, the Cubans, Angolans and SWAPO defeated the apartheid forces. The negotiations after this defeat led directly to the independence of Namibia, the unbanning of the ANC, and the fall of political apartheid. Perhaps as many as 400,000 Cuban personnel would serve in Angola over these years, and Cuban troops would stay in Angola to help protect the country and train the Angolan army until 1991, by which time South Africa had granted Namibia independence and agreed to set Nelson Mandela free from prison, directly as a result of the defeat at Quito Carnavale. This is the military background that popular Hollywood history likes to forget when discussing the fall of formal apartheid. The role of Cuba was both unique and decisive. This one fact alone, a major contribution to the fall of white supremacist apartheid, should enable most people to have at least a nuanced view of Cuba, and or even arguably rank the country as a major contributor to extending human rights struggles. But popular propaganda, in the West at least, ensures that this is not the case. Africans, Asians, and Caribbeans have certainly not generally forgotten the Cuban contribution to fighting settler colonial racism. For a long time, it was thought that Cuba was acting in Africa simply as a proxy of Moscow. But US intelligence documents told a different story, and even Henry Kissinger came to admit that this was not the case, saying Castro was probably the most genuinely revolutionary leader then in power. So if the ending of apartheid is now universally agreed to be a good thing, and Cuba played such a central role, how is it still possible to have such differing views of Castro and Mandela and of Cuba and South Africa? The short answer is that the mainstream media has been so successful in distorting basic historical facts that many people are so blinded by Cold War hangovers that they are entirely incapable of critical thought. But the other answer is rather more Machiavellian. The reality is that apartheid did not die. And thus the reason so many white conservatives now love Mandela is essentially that he let their cronies get away with it. The hypocritical worship of black freedom fighters, once they are no longer seen to pose a danger or are safely dead, Martin Luther King might be the best example of this, is one of the key ways of maintaining a liberal veneer over what in reality is brutal intent. Apartheid used racism to justify stealing enormous tracts of land by force and treating a huge black workforce like they were subhuman, with no real rights, no freedoms to travel in their own country, and no real recourse to the law with respect to the abuses of their oppressors. Needless to say, this exploited black labor force, along with the fantastic mineral wealth of Southern Africa, produced uncountable fortunes for transnational corporations and some of the highest living standards in the world for most white South Africans. Given a basic understanding of apartheid's economic underpinnings, it would not be unreasonable to ask whether that economic relationship between black and white, between large transnational corporations and black labor, has changed since 1994. If apartheid was primarily an economic system, surely to claim as we do that apartheid has ended, there must then, by inference, be something resembling economic justice occurring over there in Southern Africa. Sadly, this is not the case. Yes, formal, legalized, unapologetic political white supremacy has been defeated in South Africa, and that is a cause for celebration for any human that believes even vaguely in justice. Nonetheless, the aforementioned economic relationships have not seriously been altered in all the years since Mandela was released from prison, and this is a direct legacy of compromises that were made in those initial handover negotiations. After the apartheid handover, the South African Central Bank was to be run by the same man it was run by under apartheid. The apartheid-era finance minister also kept his position. The debts incurred by the apartheid regime had to be paid off by the newly elected ANC, and the ANC essentially accepted the IMF, World Bank neo-colonial model that has been such a disaster for other poor countries. A newly elected black government paying back loans taken out with international creditors by a white supremacist regime. It would be laughable if its effects were not so sickening. I'm not sure there has ever been a clearer case of odious debt in history. No corporation was forced to pay reparations to the victims of murders and other abuses carried out under apartheid to benefit them. Killers and torturers were not imprisoned, as would be usual after a regime fell, but rather were invited to confess their crimes and walk free. To this day, South African whites, who are a small minority, control a hugely disproportionate amount of all forms of capital in South Africa. This was not justice or the end of apartheid, but rather its morphing from a system that was unapologetically racial to one that is now unapologetically economic and, by inference, given South Africa's history, still racial. This legacy leads us to the Marikana massacre of 2012, the single largest massacre in South Africa since the infamous Sharpeville massacre of 1960. 34 striking miners were shot dead by police, and to this day, no one has been prosecuted. Lonmin, the company that the mine belonged to, is based in London. In post-apartheid South Africa, the message is still clear. Black life is expendable in pursuit of profit. A few black shareholders, CEOs, and politicians do very little to alter that reality, as those in power clearly feel very little solidarity with the dead and their families. Again, I must restate, because I don't want what I'm saying to be deliberately misunderstood, that the ending of political apartheid is to be celebrated. Majority rule, however flawed, is always preferable to racist minority rule, and the ANC have made some very interesting geopolitical moves that we know a settler government would not have made, such as refusing Britain's overtures to help invade Zimbabwe, according to Thabo Mbeki at least, and sending arms to the democratically elected Lavalas in Haiti while their democracy was being destroyed by Haitian elites and their US backers. But when black South Africans claim the ANC and the post-apartheid order has failed them, they more than have a point. The average black South African still lives in conditions of extreme poverty, often with a lack of access to basic amenities and with little hope of real change in sight. And the country remains one of the most violent and unequal in the world. In the past few years, there have been repeated waves of xenophobic, anti-African attacks against African migrants from other countries, resulting in scores of deaths. These attacks have been justified in the language of bigots everywhere. They are coming over here, stealing our jobs, and have even been encouraged by a Zulu king who described migrants as head lice. Though he insists his words were taken out of context, his repeated xenophobic remarks make this quite unlikely. That this mass mob violence is mostly directed at poor African migrants is very revealing. It seems some black South Africans have internalized the very anti-African, anti-black ideas in opposition to which their parents shed so much blood. With that said, African ethnic differences and conflict obviously predate settler colonialism by hundreds of years. Almost everywhere in the world, it seems, people love to pick on the most vulnerable. Though it must also be pointed out that South Africans have mobilized against this xenophobia with repeated marches calling on the government to do more to protect foreigners, attracting as many as 30,000 people. Obviously, this cannot all be laid at Mandela's door, any more than Cuba's achievements, outlined below, can be credited to one man alone. But Nelson Mandela was more than smart enough to know the ANC's compromises would mean continued misery, poverty, and a virtual police state for most black South Africans, though perhaps he had a longer-term vision. I would not presume to judge a man who spent almost as much time behind bars for his principles as I have spent alive, or claim that I could or would have done any better. Only time and the future of South Africa will reveal the full political consequences of Mandela and the ANC's decisions. However, it's worrying that the British Conservative government, formerly such a good friend to the apartheid regime, was, in 2016, willing to secretly use the British Army to prop up the ANC in the case of unrest. In almost complete divergence from the hero worship of Mandela, Fidel Castro has become an almost pantomime villain in the Western popular imagination, particularly in the USA, and Cuba has been under sanctions for decades, in marked contrast to apartheid South Africa. When Castro died, even a journalist at The Guardian ran with the headline, "Forget Fidel Castro's policies, what matters is that he was a dictator." But that very same journalist told us that we should stop calling Tony Blair a war criminal, and informed us that the left should be proud of his record. In all fairness, though, I was pleasantly surprised that the coverage of Castro's death generally seemed to be far more thoughtful and balanced than I had expected, outside of the usual gutter rags. I imagine that was not so much the case in America. With Castro frequently labelled a human rights abuser, in marked contrast to Mandela, we have to ask where post-Castro Cuba stands in human rights terms in comparison with post-Mandela South Africa. Seeing as both struggles were so intertwined and the popular treatment of Mandela and Castro stands so obviously juxtaposed, it would be reasonable to expect the living conditions of the average Cuban to be far worse than those of a South African, especially considering the enormous wealth and industry South Africa has and the lack of sanctions imposed on the country. That is, if human rights are really what motivates the Mandela good, Castro evil brigade. That is not what we find, which is why Cuba's most ardent critics avoid directly comparing Cuba to countries with similar histories and simply resort to adjectives. Once Cuba is directly compared to other former slave states of the Caribbean and South America, or to a country like South Africa, it starts to look like quite a different proposition. In addition to playing such a significant role in the ending of apartheid, Cuba has managed to avoid the ravages that drug trafficking wrought on the rest of the region. The murder rate in Cuba is 4 times lower than the average for Latin America. Or to put it another way, the murder rate in many US cities is 10 times worse than the murder rate in Cuba. The same is true in relation to nearby Jamaica. And South Africa frequently ranks in the top 10 for murder rate in the world. The kinds of massacres of workers that occurred at Sharpeville and Maracana simply have not occurred in post-1959 Cuba, and even the most ardent anti-Cuba ideologues could not try and pretend that the kind of police brutality that is so common in South Africa, Jamaica, Brazil, and even the USA exists on anything like that scale in Cuba. The extreme inequality and particular history that makes Latin America the most violent region of the world is due in no small part to a long history of the United States supporting dictators in the region. And this is part of why so many of the people there look to Cuba as a source of hope and pride. It is the one nation that stood up to Uncle Sam and won out. There is one area of achievement which even Cuba's critics have not been able to dismiss: healthcare. While you often hear people grudgingly admit that Cuba has good healthcare, the scale of their program and how many other countries they support is rarely properly appreciated. So it's worth looking at here in length. In 2015, Cuba became the first country in the world to eliminate the mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis. More recently, even Richard Branson felt compelled to pen an article about Cuba's extraordinary medical achievements and how the idiotic embargo prevents ordinary Americans from benefiting from Cuba's medical innovations. Cuba currently has more healthcare workers in foreign countries than all G8 countries combined. In 2014, Cuba had 50,000 healthcare workers in 65 countries. That is more than the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and UNICEF combined. Since 1960, over 101,000 Cuban health workers have provided care in 110 countries. There is even a history of Cuban medical outreach to countries openly hostile to Cuba, such as Nicaragua during the Somoza dictatorship, and even the USA. To show just how far Cuba has come in this area, in 1965, Cuba had 1 physician for every 1,200 people. But by 2005, Cuba boasted 1 physician for every 167 people, a number unequaled anywhere in the world. In 2014, the island had 83,000 doctors, some 5,000 more than Canada, a wealthy country that has a population that is over 3 times larger. Recent World Health Organization data put Cuba's health indicators, such as life expectancy and infant mortality, in line with the US and Canada. In addition, Cuba has offered free, that is, the cost is borne by the Cuban people, medical scholarships to thousands of students from across the world on the condition that they return and serve the poor in their own countries. As of 2014, over 23,000 students from 83 countries had graduated from the ELAM campus, Cuba's international medical school, since 2005. Cuban healthcare workers are often among the first responders in major global crises such as the Ebola outbreak in 2014 or the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005. These facts are recognized by such communist propaganda outlets as the World Health Organization and all of the national governments that Cuba helps. To anybody that actually cares about global justice, human life, and human rights, Cuban medical internationalism is without a doubt one of the greatest humanitarian enterprises of the 21st century. Cuba does not demand that Jamaica or Haiti or Liberia sell off their water systems or incur crippling debt or elect communist leaders that Cuba approves of in exchange for this help. The Cuban people elect to do this work out of genuine revolutionary solidarity with other, overwhelmingly poor, black and brown people in the global south. Britain offers nothing like this scale of condition-free support, as far as I am aware, even to its former colonies. And we are currently in the process of dismantling our own domestic National Health Service. So, if the average Cuban is several times less likely to be murdered than the average South African, either by another Cuban or by the state, has access to healthcare, housing, and education to a far greater degree, and can expect to live more than 10 years longer, it would be quite fair to say that post-Castro Cuba is faring better than post-Mandela South Africa on many important human indices. But let's even suppose for a moment that everything that has ever been said about Cuba was totally true. Let's also say that Castro barbecued dissidents alive while drinking cold beer and sodomized people with knives or banned women from driving. That still would not explain why conservatives or mainstream politicians more generally have such disdain for him, seeing as they are fine with such deeds in other contexts. When we do look at some of the regimes that our governments have armed and or otherwise done business with, we see some of the greatest human rights abusers of the post-1945 world. Pol Pot in Cambodia, General Pinochet in Chile, Suharto in Indonesia, Nigeria during Biafra, Israel, and the horrendous Saudi war being waged in Yemen right now. The list is long and responsible for millions of deaths and unimaginable misery. It takes an extremely gullible person to truly believe that human rights is what motivates our government. Conservative and even respectable liberal opinion has chosen to adopt Mandela as a hero and Castro as a villain because of, in my opinion, a number of factors, plain old intellectual obedience being one of them. Yet anyone that is willing to have a nuanced, even favourable view of the likes of Tony Blair and Barack Obama, but unwilling to extend that nuance to Castro and Cuba, is obviously not motivated by the behaviours of the men in question and how they wielded political power, but rather by ideology, nationalism, bigotry, or ignorance. To be clear, I am not one of these religious leftists who thinks St. Castro can do no wrong. I'm well aware that there were mistakes, shortcomings, and abuses of power in Cuba, and that Cuba has many challenges still to overcome, including its own internal racism. There are many valid reasons to critique the Cuban Revolution and Castro himself. However, what I am saying is that it takes quite substantial delusions of grandeur to believe that you or I could have done a better job of running that country while under blockade from the wealthiest nation ever, having to deal with state-sponsored terrorism and being under constant threat of assassination and the coups that the US or UK have exported to so many other places. I have had a hard enough time writing this book, let alone trying to run a country. But if the success or failures of the Cuban Revolution are to be honestly assessed, surely they have to be looked at in comparison to other similar societies. It's much easier to focus on the demonization or demagoguery of an individual than actually discuss the outcomes of a political process. By focusing on the person of Fidel Castro or of Mandela, for completely opposite reasons, we can avoid any real analysis of the legacies of the apartheid struggle and the Cuban Revolution. Of course, such a comparison would make the Cuban Revolution's achievements and shortcomings vis-à-vis South Africa and other similar nations quite plain to anyone who can count. Why is any of this important to race and class in the UK, you may ask? First, because these global anti-racist struggles were connected. Many of the same people that faced down British fascists at the Battle of Lewisham in 1977 were active in anti-apartheid throughout the 1980s. Second, because as a global power, Britain's domestic politics and public opinions affect the whole world, as domestic British politics are in turn affected by global events. My childhood was shaped by the presence of the anti-apartheid struggle in the same way that my young adulthood was shaped by the invasion of Iraq. These things have informed how millions of us view our own society and its place in the world. But it's also important because the Castro-Mandela dichotomy exposes the way the mainstream loves to worship a supposedly non-racist country as long as it leaves the accepted class hierarchies in place, but hates a society that has revolutionized some of its class relationships despite its actual material contribution to global anti-racist struggle. Either way, genuine anti-racism cannot be what motivates such favoritism. While Cuba's achievements might look meagre to the average middle-class liberal or conservative Briton, to the average Jamaican, Haitian, Brazilian or Indian, what Cuba has been able to do for the masses of its people is impressive indeed. The average middle-class liberal Brit might be able to brush off a society not falling prey to American imperialism, attaining universal healthcare and education, and even assisting many Commonwealth countries in that regard. But for those of us whose parents or grandparents came from places like Jamaica, Nigeria, and India, who go back home regularly and thus have some realistic yardstick by which to measure Cuba, the legacies of the Cuban Revolution look quite different. I've seen Cuban doctors in Jamaica training people and saving lives with my own eyes. And while it's easy to idealize the achievements of a socialist state while living in comfort in Britain, it's equally easy for others to ignore the fact that Cuba has made advances in some key areas that almost no other third world country has, nor even the richest nation on earth. When I was a child, black and brown voices in British politics were generally quite fringe, to say the least. That situation has changed quite a bit. And though we should not overstate things, it really shows no signs of being reversible. As the percentage of the British population that hails from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean grows, it's projected to be 30% by 2050. How will this affect dialogue, debate, and the subsequent direction of British politics? Those of us who are directly connected to the Third World have very different renderings and rememberings of political events than mainstream opinion, and our traditions cannot help but continue to shape and be shaped by the future of Britain. Part of this ideological battle is fought over popular memories of historical figures like Mandela and Castro, and can be seen playing out in real time in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. A campaign in Britain directly inspired by students in South Africa, demanding that the worship of white supremacist colonial figures like Cecil Rhodes be stopped, that statues of them be torn down out of respect for the victims of atrocities they promoted, and in recognition of the hope for a different world order from one defined by empire, racial hierarchy, and Cold War geopolitics. At the outbreak of the First World War, the vast majority of the world was colonized by European powers and the Ottomans, and race was a fully accepted way of accounting for human difference in international affairs among the great powers. Despite some doubts about overt displays of white supremacy, even after the carnage of the First World War, British, American, and French elites felt confident enough to reject out of hand Japan's suggestion that a clause recognizing racial equality be inserted into the Treaty of Versailles. It would take another world war and the genocides perpetuated by the Nazis for the enlightened governments of the democratic Western world to entertain the idea that white supremacy might not be a given. Even when the Second World War ended, the colonized world still had an entirely different project confronting it than the European societies under whose flags they had fought. While European states focused on rebuilding themselves with massive amounts of help from the United States, their colonies now had the space, capacity, and experience to fight for their own freedom against the very people with whom they had fought shoulder to shoulder against fascism. Make no mistake about it. In 1945, even after using their colonial troops to defeat the Nazis, both Britain and France had every intention of holding on to their white supremacist empires. It is one of history's great ironies that the most extreme incarnation of white supremacy, the Nazis, did more to undermine white dominance, damage Western prestige, and make space for third world freedom struggles than any other force in the previous 3 centuries. For reasons of self-preservation only, you would have thought that Western liberals would have learned this lesson. Yet we live in a world where literal card-carrying Nazis getting punched in the face or being refused platforms to speak garners more liberal outrage than 12-year-old Tamir Rice being executed on camera by the police while playing alone in the park. Only when I see the free speech purists campaigning for the right of a Salafist who thinks 9/11 was wonderful to speak at America or Britain's top universities will I perhaps believe in their sincerity. The way these people speak of free speech, you would think that McCarthyism was 1,000 years ago. In the years since 1945, mass movements among the black, brown, and yellow world majority have fundamentally remade the world. Decolonization may well turn out to have been the most significant historical process of the second half of the 20th century, but you would never know this from reading mainstream historiography. Through this process, which included some radical critics from within the colonizing societies themselves, the accepted racial hierarchy of the world has been so comprehensively redrawn that today even most bigots find it embarrassing to be called racist. Both Mandela's ANC and Castro's Cuba played complicated roles in this racial remaking of the world, and both men had tremendous respect for the contributions of the other. But we do history a serious disservice when we allow it to be reduced to simple dichotomies. My childhood was indelibly shaped by the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Even though I lived thousands of miles away, and the momentum of that struggle had swung decisively against the apartheid regime by the time my earliest memories were formed. Nelson Mandela was already a name synonymous with freedom and wisdom, justice and principle by the time I took my first steps. However, it was not until over a decade later, when in my late teens I started to do a little reading and research of my own, that I even heard mention of Cuba's contribution to anti-apartheid. This obvious omission, along with the simplistic narratives that surrounded Mandela and Castro, was a valuable lesson to me about how the powerful craft history and news media to their own ends. This realization that major parts of recent political events could quickly be forgotten or indeed totally ignored if they did not fit the script helped encourage me to always seek multiple sources for a given story or situation, and compelled me to always distrust or at least question what I was being told and why I was being told it. A trait that frequently brought me into conflict with my teachers. Chapter 9. The Ku Klux Klan stopped crime by killing black people. I was visiting my soon-to-be secondary school. These visits are a ritual. They are designed to give students a sense of the scale and scope of big school, to make sure the new terrain is somewhat familiar come September. During the visit, I got to meet the rest of my future year group, and we toured around the school. I remember being impressed by the science labs with their Bunsen burners, but most impressed with the size of the football pitch, of course. I'd like to note that my secondary school was actually a pretty good school. It has produced a notable number of creatives and certainly played a key role in my development. I had some great teachers there and even better friends. Nonetheless, like everything else in life, it was full of contradictions. Back to the visit. We also got to meet some of our future teachers. One look was enough. It may sound dramatic or presumptuous, but that's often all it takes. Eyes tell so much when they are left to wander unguarded. I could tell from that first, simple glance that it was going to be a long 5 years and that my relationship with this particular teacher was going to be a major source of stress throughout secondary school. Adults think they can fool children, but children are often able to judge a character so accurately and so quickly it's almost like a sixth sense. So it was when I first met that teacher. Her eyes could not hide her disdain for this mouthy, overconfident, articulate, obviously working class boy. I could feel a sense of racial discomfort coming from her as well. I'd started to be able to sense this type of feeling. I officially joined the school that September, and my initial impression was proven right in quite spectacular fashion. My clashes with this teacher began almost immediately. Our worldviews were so radically different. My political heroes were Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. Hers were Margaret Thatcher and Winston Churchill. It was never going to work out. She believed in Britain's inherent moral superiority and that the British Empire was essentially a civilizing mission, while I had an unusual amount of information for a teenager, courtesy of Pan-African Saturday School, that contradicted or at least challenged much of what she believed. When we argued about the scramble for Africa, she reproduced the old railways argument, the one that goes something like, colonialism gave the natives railways, so it was good. The end. Another time, she went as far as saying that Europeans did not actually know Africans were human, so you can't really blame them for enslaving Africans. Whereas when they got to China, the humanity of the Chinese smacked them in the face. I was not aware of the Opium Wars at the time, nor did I have much information about the treatment of Chinese indentured labor, So I'm not sure how exactly I counted this. I wish I had known back then that British-ruled Hong Kong was governed by some of the same kind of racist apartheid laws as South Africa and other colonies. In short, the Chinese were treated just like other subject races, albeit for a shorter time period. So clearly British imperialists were not smacked in the face by the humanity of the Chinese, despite the historical achievements of Chinese civilization. In the end, I think I asked something like, why did colonizers and enslavers rape their human property so frequently if they didn't know that they were human? Anyway, this teacher used to refer to certain boys in our class as sandpit boys, meaning to infer that they had the mental aptitude of 5-year-olds playing in a sandpit. These were generally boys who were not fortunate enough to have had the radical community education and perhaps the family encouragement that I had benefited from. One of these boys in particular I knew from primary school. He had a mother that was a severe alcoholic and often suffered clear and obvious parental neglect. Rather than investigate what the reasons might be for their lack of confidence and participation in the classroom, the teacher labelled them sandpit boys. By contrast, Ann Taylor, my favourite primary school teacher, went well beyond the call of duty and used to feed this same boy. She even bought him some shoes once. How big a difference a teacher's personal attitudes can make. I don't think chavs existed as a term back then, but no doubt it was that type of stereotyping of people from less fortunate family circumstances that this teacher was aiming at when she called them sandpit boys. By association of class, I should have been one of the sandpit boys. After all, was I not on free school meals, just like them? Did my clothes and shoes not speak of my family's dire finances? Could you not hear the poverty in my accent and see it in my skin, my walk, and my eyes? But I was among the top of the class for all subjects, except art, of course. Something which strangely bothered some teachers, this one included, but seemed to spare me the nickname. Nevertheless, I felt a class affinity for the sandpit boys. I felt like I could see what was happening to them and wished I could give them what I'd been given. During another debate, this teacher compared the exclusion of girls from our lunchtime football games to Jim Crow-era US racism. While I totally accept the severity of gender oppression, this seemed to me a rather odd comparison, given that there were no signs excluding girls from the football pitch, let alone lunchtime lynchings, and that the state did not enforce this no girls on the pitches policy. And I said as much to her. What her comment did show was that she was able to recognize how gender conditioning could subtly shape the expectations and behaviors of girls and prevent them from going somewhere that they were not really being prevented from going. For there is no doubt that the boys controlled the football pitch every lunchtime and would have probably viewed girls trying to play football as an incursion. My teacher could not, however, understand how young boys from poorer, less educated families came to be intimidated by an education that no one was really preventing them from attaining. She told me confidently that all women had harder lives than any men on the planet. She meant brown and black men, of course. Not out of feminist solidarity with the brown and black women of the global south, as you will understand more fully in a moment, but rather to tell me that I was essentially complaining about nothing when I spoke about historic racial injustice. My relationship with her and a few other teachers meant that school felt like a battleground instead of a joy. A constant war of attrition with people who did not want the best for me, but nonetheless were supposed to be educating me. The teachers that were in my corner told me I could not let them win. I could not drop out of school or allow myself to be expelled like so many of my friends. It was almost as if I was representing not just myself, but rather that my academic success, and that of one or two others, was a vindication of young black boys as a group. The school, for all its Camden liberalism, knew very well that black students were being expelled at much higher rates than other students, but did not really attempt to investigate the issue. In just one example of how far this ambivalence spread, my sister's sociology teacher told her that when a new group of students joined the school, certain teachers would bet, based solely on a child's name, before even having met that child, about the likelihood of said child actually finishing school. If the child were named Leon Smith or Wayne Johnson, typical black names, then they would bet against him. More often than not, they were proven right. All of this is just the background to the final showdown. During one particular debate in year 10, the ship really hit the fan. Some context. There was another teacher in our school who was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he ran an extracurricular history class for black students. It's worth remembering that Spike Lee's Malcolm X film was still in public consciousness, and the NOI had also been very visible during the Stephen Lawrence trial, so people tended to be more aware of who the NOI are than they would be today. These extracurricular classes became a source of tension for some teachers, and the school temporarily suspended the classes, though they never explained why. I started a petition in response to this suspension, and for whatever reason, the classes were reinstated. I was never sure if my petition had any effect or not, but I was caught in the act of collecting signatures by the deputy head, who looked rather embarrassed. That same teacher from the NOI had designed a history module called Black Peoples of the Americas that he managed to get onto the school history syllabus. The other teacher declared quite openly that this was her least favourite module and that she hated teaching it. It is in the context of that module that many of our most heated debates about race took place. One day during the module, we somehow got onto debating the NOI, and she asserted that the Nation of Islam was essentially the same as the KKK, but black. This has become a rather cliched argument among some white conservatives, and it essentially equates black people who are living under apartheid saying not nice things about white people with a tradition of actual violent terrorism. The message is clear. White people's hurt feelings are conceptually equivalent to black humans' actual lives. No matter that mainstream white anthropology had argued for generations that black people were not human, and many societies set up literal human zoos to demonstrate that, no matter that during the era in which the NOI's racial ideology was formed, all of Africa was colonized and racial slavery was still in living memory for some, no matter that black people's supposed subhumanity was enshrined in the founding of the USA and that lynchings were still common when the NOI was founded in the 1930s. None of that context was needed in terms of explaining the appeal of the NOI's ideas. If whiteness is used to legitimize slavery, genocide, and colonialism, is it really a surprise that at least a minority of people victimized in this way would turn around and argue that white people were inherently evil? Anyway, I argued back that no matter what their opinions were on racial evolution, or other flaws for that matter, the NOI had no history of lynching white people, of collecting their body parts as souvenirs, of bombing white churches, and of killing children and pregnant women. What's more, the NOI did much good, like cleaning up drug addicts and policing some of America's worst black ghettos, helping to stop crime. The NOI had indeed sent some of its members, unarmed, to challenge the drug dealers in some of the toughest US inner cities. The debate had been raging for pretty much the whole lesson, ranging over various subjects, and I knew the class was siding with the logic of the 15-year-old boy rather than the middle-aged, university-educated teacher with greying hair. Losing the argument was clearly too much for her to bear, and her response was so profoundly racist, even by her standards, that it still shocks me to this day. She blurted out, "The Ku Klux Klan also stopped crime by killing black people." Now I know you're probably reading this in disbelief, but I'll repeat it for clarity and so you can be sure it's not an extended typo. The Ku Klux Klan also stopped crime by killing black people. Now imagine, standing in front of students whom you are supposed to teach in one of the most multicultural areas in the world and saying that killing black people, including children, with all the spectacle and pomp of a summer fete, is somehow crime fighting. The genocidal implications of this statement are obvious. I'm sure that She and many others that think like her would indeed be totally happy to see black humans wiped from the face of the earth. I'm equally sure that for such radicalized extremists, having to teach self-assured little black boys who have actually read a few books must be like torture. How many more people like her have to teach children they actually hate, but just happen to never have had their hatred brought to the surface? I told her to fuck off about 10 times in response. My composure was completely gone, and the slight arrogance that I had been feeling at outsmarting my teacher had been ripped away from me. Now I felt only rage and hurt. I knew she did not like black people, but I had not fully grasped the extent and depth of her hatred before that day. I felt dirty and ashamed, and something that was like confusion but wasn't quite that. Black people have never really been able to understand the revulsion and compulsion to violence that our skin generates in these kinds of people. A hatred so profoundly illogical, I doubt even those that feel it can really explain it. I had the distinct urge to throw my chair at her, and I'm pretty sure that, had she been a man, I would have done just that and certainly got expelled as a result. The class collectively gasped, and a few other students made statements of protest and shook their heads. They knew a line had been crossed. She looked at me, resigned. She had said it now. It was out in the open, and there was no use in apologizing. So, she did not even bother trying. I can't remember how the rest of the lesson panned out, and whether I stormed out of the class. I just remember swearing repeatedly, shouting and really wanting to punch her in her bright red face, but knowing that hitting a woman, even a woman that wished death on me, was not something I could bring myself to do. I also feel like there was something approaching relief in both her and me. I had always wanted her to expose herself fully, and she had trodden carefully, sort of, but clearly she found restraining her real opinion quite challenging. Now I had the full truth, though it did indeed taste bitter. Her comments became a mini-scandal. Students that were not even in the class seemed to know before the end of the day. I went home that night, and when I told my mum what had happened, I realized that I obviously had to act. Something about repeating her words made the full absurdity clearer and gave the situation an urgency. My mum was in total agreement and support. I decided to write to the school governors to complain. Surely someone with beliefs like this, expressed so publicly and openly, could not be permitted to go on teaching. How could she possibly teach people she believed to be half-human, innately criminal savages? I had already learned to distrust the levers of power, and so doubted that she would actually lose her job or face any severe disciplinary action. But I at least hoped that the governors would do something. What actually transpired was a profound lesson in institutionalized racism and the protection of abuses by power. The headmaster somehow ended up with my letter, and he called me into his office for a meeting. I explained the events to him, roughly as I have retold them here, and he sheepishly promised to talk to the teacher in question and clear it up. It was instantly obvious to me that he would have preferred me not to have put him in this uncomfortable position of, actually having to do part of his job and administer justice. Then, in a moment of almost unwritable irony, he gave me, or should I say tried to bribe me with, a book about Martin Luther King. I still have the book somewhere. It's called The Children. The incident became, for me, the perfect embodiment of Dr. King's statement to the effect that the greatest impediment to racial justice in America was not the open bigot, but the indifferent and cowardly white liberal, more concerned with a quiet life than justice. There is no question that my Martin Luther King reading headmaster would have thought of himself as a liberal, as open-minded, and certainly non-racist. And maybe he was all of those things. Yet he chose to do nothing when confronted by such profound abuse. A few weeks passed, and I had not heard back from the head teacher. So I went to see him. He told me that the teacher had denied saying what I was accusing her of saying, but had admitted to playing devil's advocate, and essentially that he was not going to take any action, not even by asking the other 30 or so children in the class that day what had happened. She would keep her job. There would not even be so much as a hearing, and from what I was told, though it may be an urban myth, she was promoted after I left the school. I am not suggesting that the school thought so much of me that it waited till I left before promoting her, but rather that they did not care enough about her white supremacist views to not promote her. Perhaps if I had been a rich kid with a hotshot lawyer for a parent and the ability to go to the press and generate a story, kind of like I am now, the school may have felt compelled to do something. Who knows? But not only was I black, I was also poor and had no such connections. I'm also pretty sure that had the teacher from the Nation of Islam said that Nazis stopped greed by killing Jews, he would, quite rightly, have been seen as a psychopath and lost his job immediately. I left the whole affair wondering how many other teachers thought like this one, and what impact does their racism have on their ability to effectively teach students from Britain's former colonies. My mum and I demanded that I be removed from her classes. The school reluctantly, but perhaps a little relieved, agreed. I never forgot the larger lesson, though. Many self-proclaimed, selectively reading, MLK-quoting liberals would choose to support, or at least ignore, injustice rather than rock the boat when in positions of power. The following year, when I took my GCSEs, I was still extremely angry about the whole affair, and so I chose to write a protest on the exam paper of the subject she taught me about the cultural and ethical bias of my teaching, rather than to do the actual exam. I still remember the exam board observer seeing me sat, arms folded, trying to encourage me to have a go. It was understandable that she assumed I was a struggling student rather than a wannabe revolutionary, and I really wanted to let her know why I was not writing, but of course, I could not. So I wrote the same protest passage out over and over again so it would look like I was at least trying. I got a U as a result, and despite all my other A stars, it is probably the exam grade I am still most proud of. Was my experience in secondary school unique, isolated, the result of one bad apple? Or is there a general pattern of conflict between teachers and black students? Is there any evidence that the systemic discrimination against black students that we saw in action in primary school continues into secondary school? Unfortunately, the answer to the second question is a resounding yes. In academic circles concerned with race and education, there are two buzz phrases: the exclusion gap and the attainment gap. The exclusion gap refers to the fact that black students have historically been always at least 3 times as likely to be excluded as their white counterparts. Some years, 6 times as likely. However, there is a significant difference between the rates of expulsion for black students of Caribbean origin and those hailing from Africa, with British African students being far less likely, especially in recent years, to be expelled than those whose great-grandparents came from the Caribbean. At first glance, this difference in outcomes between 2 different types of black students, which is also replicated in academic attainment, might seem to confirm certain stereotypes of Caribbean communities. However, at 3 or more generations removed, many of these Caribbean children have never even been to the Caribbean. So what we are really comparing is 4th-generation black English children with children mostly born in the UK to African parents. Also, a close inspection of the relevant research shows that a more sophisticated explanation will be needed. For example, a 2006 DFES report into the exclusion gap found that black Caribbean pupils are 3 times more likely to be excluded from school than white pupils. When free school meals and special educational needs were taken into account, black Caribbean pupils were still 2.6 times more likely to be excluded from school than white pupils. Excluded black pupils were less likely to fit the typical profile of excluded white pupils, such as having special educational needs, free school meals, longer and more numerous previous exclusions, poor attendance records, criminal records, or being looked after children. In translation, this means that even black English students of Caribbean origin from less challenging family circumstances, even those with decent grades and good previous attendance who have displayed better previous behavior, are still far more likely to be permanently expelled than other ethnic groups. Why is this such a huge problem? Because permanent exclusion from school virtually dictates the future of a person's life. In the words of Martin Neri, the former Director General of Her Majesty's Prison Service, the 13,000 young people excluded from school each year might as well be given a date by which to join the prison service sometime later down the line. The 2006 DFES report concluded, "The clear message of the literature is that, to a significant extent, the exclusion gap is caused by largely unwitting but systematic racial discrimination in the application of disciplinary and exclusions policies. Many cite this as evidence of institutional racism. The department has a legal duty to eliminate such discrimination under the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000. So, the empirical data and government studies pretty much echo what black people have been saying ever since the 1960s. That black students in particular have been treated unfairly within the British education system for decades, beyond just the usual challenges of being poor, and that little to nothing has been done about it, beyond lip service. Of course, many will still claim, even when presented with the hard data and thorough investigations, that it is all in black pupils' and parents' imaginations, or that, yep, you guessed it, we just have a chip on our shoulder. The attainment gap refers to differentials in performance between ethnic groups in schools and what could cause them. Before we look at the evidence, I would like to point out the obvious fact that I am not suggesting that all differential achievement between human groups in a given area of activity is the result of discrimination. What I am arguing is that where clear evidence of discrimination exists, it should be removed. And then, if individuals and/or groups do not take advantage of the opportunities afforded, we can talk more clearly about personal responsibility. As you already saw in Chapter 3, under the old empirical baseline assessments, black students actually outperformed their white counterparts. But now that the mode of assessment has been left entirely to teachers' whims, that is no longer the case. You also saw how much teachers underassess black students' intelligence throughout primary school to age 11. This pattern, unsurprisingly, continues throughout secondary school. Warwick University investigated teacher bias by observing the proportion of black Caribbean pupils who are entered for higher-tier maths and science tests at age 14. Being entered for higher tier allows a student to be awarded as high as an A-star, whereas being entered for foundation means the highest possible mark is a C. They found that, at the same level of previous academic attainment, for every 3 white British pupils entered for higher tier, only 2 black Caribbean pupils were entered. These figures hold even when we account for gender, free school meals, maternal education, home ownership, and single-parent households, in addition to their prior academic attainment. Once again, teachers' assessments underestimate the academic potential of black students. Both the Warwick study and the Bristol one examined in Chapter 3 looked at every state school in the UK, painting a bleak picture for black students. This means that under the current system of setting and tiering, it is literally mathematically impossible for above a certain percentage of black students to get top grade GCSEs, as they are significantly less likely to be entered for higher tier GCSE papers, even when they have the same previous academic attainment and family circumstances as white students. To recap the odds stacked against black children in British schools, black students are underassessed at 5, dramatically underassessed at 11, significantly less likely to be entered for higher tier exams when they have the same previous academic attainment, 2.6 times more likely to be expelled even when control factors are taken into account. Despite all of this, in recent years, in particular since 2013, black children of African origin have surpassed the national average in GCSE attainment, with some national groups, such as children of Nigerian and Ghanaian origin, faring particularly well. This is extraordinarily impressive given that children of African origin are concentrated in Hackney, Peckham and Croydon/Thornton Heath, which are some of the poorest and toughest regions of the capital. If we were not so addicted to social Darwinism, black African students might well serve as an example for other working class students to imitate. Yet, despite all of the actual evidence of obvious neglect and/or stereotyping of black students, regardless of class, over the past few years, a trend can be observed in the British media of positing working class white boys as the victims of the education system. The Lost Boys, how the white working class got left behind. New Statesman. It's no surprise that white working class boys do badly at school. Their morale is likely to be lower than more superficially oppressed groups. Tim Lott, Guardian. White boys let down by the education system. Daily Telegraph. White boys are being left behind by the education system. Daily Mail. After noting the obviously sympathetic tone of the articles across the print media spectrum, from the Guardian to the Mail, in marked contrast to the manner in which some of the publications report about so-called ethnic minorities, we are left to examine the actual data and ask if these headlines are accurate. It's interesting that all of the articles in question chose to focus on race rather than the British class system as a whole, as it's a matter of fact that the gap between white working class boys and other ethnic groups in the same social class is far smaller than the gap between poor white boys and the white middle class. The message from these journalists and those that peddled this narrative is clear. It's fine for working class white kids to fail relative to the white middle classes, but they should never fall behind the darkies. Furthermore, working class here is being defined only as those on free school meals, which does not include 86% of the white population. Students from poorer backgrounds who receive free school meals do much less well in exams than students who do not. This holds true for every ethnic group in Britain. Girls also do better than boys. Again, this holds true for every ethnic group. I'd like to be clear at this point that I agree working class white boys have been neglected at every stage of British society. That is what classism is and does. So it's not support and sympathy for working class white boys that I have an issue with. It's the notable lack of support for similar issues when they affect other demographics within the working class more clearly, and also the ludicrous assertion that the white working class are being neglected because they are white. Of course, within British society, the working class is taken to mean the white working class more often than not anyway. It won't matter how many empirical studies you can provide, including the DFES's own report, or studies that have looked at every school in the UK, or decades of academics and leading experts in the field showing empirically and measurably that anti-black racism is still a serious, systemic issue adversely affecting outcomes for black students. Many will do intellectual backflips to conclude something else is the cause, even when the black person talking to them is already successful and educated and therefore has nothing to make excuses about. Naturally, it's far easier to believe that there is just something wrong with black people than really accept the scale of the mundane injustice of everyday black life in Britain. Decades of unfair expulsions, potential wasted, and dreams derailed. In this national context, and against this backdrop of history, my experiences in school start to make complete sense. Not as isolated incidents with a few bad apples, but rather as systemic problems. there is an inability among some white teachers to be able to cope with the wrong student being top of the class. And said teachers deploy a range of actions to mitigate it, from open bullying, my magic button, to sly attempts to hold me back, special needs group, hitting me, sending me out, telling me I am unable to read things well within my capacity, even advocating genocide at the extreme. Because I went to a very mixed school with lots of middle-class white children, unlike my cousins in Harlesden and Brixton, I was able to see even more clearly that my treatment by these teachers stood in marked difference to the manner in which similarly smart, white, and even other non-black children were treated. I was one of the lucky few who had the right family and community support to make it through the tumult. But what about all those other black children represented in this data? All those unfairly marked down, the gifts and talents they have overlooked, shoved into lower tiers where they really had no place being, but where they are now locked into a limited range of possible achievement that will affect their entire life. For some, this will all sound a little conspiratorial, but the scholarship is pretty clear if you bother to read it. My individual experience is just one number among all those graphs and lines. Chapter 10. Birds of a Feather, Britain and America. Black American culture was an ever-present force in my upbringing. In our house, James Brown got as much play as Dennis Brown, and Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Aretha, she needs no second name, Nina Simone, and all the icons of Black American music were names that I knew as well as any reggae artist. This influence was so strong that the first time I performed publicly, it was to dance to Ray Charles's song, Shake a Tail Feather, with my siblings and cousins on stage at the Hackney Empire, in front of a packed house. Black British identity more broadly was and is fashioned out of the material left from our home countries, Ghana, Jamaica, Nigeria, our concrete experiences and reality here in Britain, and from the inspiration of other black populations, mostly America. We grew up with Malcolm and Martin posters on the wall at the barbers and in our food shops. Our parents used the language of black power for their own ends and even set up their own Black Panther parties. We watched The Cosby Show and A Different World and both delighted in and envied HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities, wishing we had our own. For those of us that are Caribbean, we grew up with cousins in New York sending us the latest DJ Clue or Red Alert mixtape or VCRs. Remember those? Of the latest stage shows where US rappers and Jamaican dancehall artists had performed on the same bills, usually somewhere in Brooklyn. We experienced Black American culture not as a foreign presence, but as an extension of ourselves. Our overseas family who were articulating to the world what we felt we were going through too. While there are huge differences in the experiences of Black Britain and Black America, we focused on the similarities and solidarities. We watched LA react to the Rodney King verdict, and we remembered Brixton or Handsworth in 1985. We transposed Cliff Huxtable into an old West Indian grandad, and we knew that Kool Herc, Biggie's mother, Pete Rock, and KRS-One were from Yard too. We know Colin Powell is also of Jamaican origin, but we don't claim him. The black bookstores that could once be found in every major area of African Caribbean settlement in Britain were filled with volumes of scholarship from as many Black Americans as Caribbeans or West Africans. Just as our record stores gave prominence to Jamaican music, but you could certainly find any soul, R&B or hip-hop you would need at Red Records in Brixton, Body Groove in Tottenham, or Honest John's in Ladbroke Grove. Thanks to gentrification and change in technology, 2 of these 3 iconic stores are now gone. The legendary Black Dread record shop in Brixton, that for so long serviced the UK's premier sound systems and the public alike with their 7s and 12s of the latest music from Jamaica, has similarly vanished. The next time I remember stepping on stage, I was 10, and I rapped Slam by the Queen's hip-hop group Onyx and Soundboy Killin' by Jamaican dancehall artist Mega Banton to my definitely confused classmates and teachers at an end-of-year talent contest. This performance symbolized the syncretism of my generation. British-born to British-born parents, we started to identify with the US as much as the Caribbean. As a result of this decline in exclusively Caribbean, predominantly Jamaican influence, we produced new worldviews, attitudes, and art, or at least a new negotiation between the roots, reggae and Rasta, of our parents and the new dancehall, hip-hop and R&B coming from the ghettos of Jamaica and the States. During my teenage years, local UK variants of MC-based cultures also rose to prominence via an extensive network of pirate, illegal radio stations and club nights. UK Garage brought a Jamaican sound system aesthetic and setup to an originally American genre, mirroring the fusion that gave birth to hip-hop. There was also the uniquely UK-based hybrid Jungle, which fused Jamaican reggae and dancehall with the Amen break, the same drum break that is the basis of much legendary hip-hop, and UK rave music. I love Jungle for the rawness of the bass lines, the speed and intensity of the drums, and the incredible use of samples that gave it a totally unique sound, a sound laced with the grit of Bristol and London's council estates, echoing the indelible, irreversible influence of Caribbean expats on British music. Jungle was a stamp on the face of safe and respectable British music, and it was that grit that attracted the rude boys and gangsters from every hood to come to jungle raves. Guys did not dress up. They came to a jungle dance as if they'd come straight off the block. Guns were brandished and shots were fired. But as jungle started to cross over, it morphed into a safer, softer variant of itself that seemed to me quite consciously designed to appeal to a whiter, more middle-class audience and to keep the rude boys away. I think it worked on both counts. Naturally, the British media and law enforcement took ample opportunity to racialize the gangster minority as a general black problem in a way they never did with drug overdoses and sexual assaults that remain a common issue throughout the UK rave and festival culture. Garage raves had some of the same problems with violence as jungle did, despite the fact that the atmosphere was totally different. Garage blended soulful and smooth samples with a much slower, much more danceable beat than jungle, and consequently, garage raves were far better dressed and had a significantly greater female presence. I went to more garage raves than I could possibly count, long before I was supposed to. At 15 years old, I was at the now legendary Pure Silk New Year's Eve 1999 rave at Wembley Conference Centre with 10,000 other revellers. It was £50 a ticket, back then. Garage was big money, street dudes cleaned a lot of cash, and young black entrepreneurs, DJs and MCs became hood rich long before the mainstream had taken any notice. Me and my homies made unforgettable memories. I MC'd over jungle and garage on my father's sound system between the ages of 13 and 16. I still love dancehall, and Bounty Killer remains one of my top 10 lyricists in any genre, but none of these genres or scenes would influence me quite like hip-hop did. My dad and stepdad had acquainted me with NWA, Public Enemy, and Big Daddy Kane, but I was too young when they were at their peak to really experience them in all their glory. Being born in 1983 meant I was just 7 when Public Enemy's legendary album, Fear of a Black Planet, was released. But my parents played it so much, I memorized almost all of the words. In the mid-1990s, when I started to get hairs on my chest and got my first job, I struck out and found my own hip-hop. I was 13 years old, working for £20 per day on Saturdays at a local DIY store. And any week that my family did not need the money, I'd be off to the West End to the nerdy record stores that stocked hard-to-get US imports, or up to our bootlegger in Tottenham, and I'd spend my entire £20 on CDs. I had 2 bootleggers, a person that copies and sells black market CDs, both of them black Americans. one from Roxbury in Boston and the other from Brownsville in New York, two of America's most notorious ghettos. The stories they told us of the hood back home only added authenticity to the purchases. It's probably hard for people under 20 to remember now what a precious commodity a CD was, but I felt absolutely no qualms about foregoing a few meals so that I could get the latest US rap release. I had no other access to the music. These records were not played on the radio, not even by the hip-hop specialists, and there was no internet. There was only the import CD shop and the bootlegger. As my age group searched for new meanings and identities, American rap provided a soundtrack for what seemed like a reality we shared with our Black American cousins. We lived in public housing. Some of our uncles and fathers went to prison. We were relatively poor. We knew people who had been shot and stabbed, and likely those doing the shooting and stabbing too, just as we knew members of our community who had been killed and brutalized by the police and never gotten a hint of justice. At its best, our identification with Black American culture helped give us the political strength and insights around which to organize. In the same way that my gangster uncles had come of age politically by reading Huey Newton and watching Muhammad Ali interviews. It instilled in us a new vocabulary and new ways of understanding race and class, and inculcated a sense of shared blackness, a sense that we were not alone in facing the challenges coming our way. But our over-identification with Black American culture was not without its challenges and problems. We struggled to find our own voice, based on our own realities, and many of us MCs even rapped in fake American accents, as I did until I was 13. One day, as I showed my older sister my new bars, tinged with Staten Island slang and drawl, she told me off for being fake, and made me try rapping in my own voice. I had become so enthralled with US hip-hop that I found it difficult to even conceive of spitting in my own accent, despite the fact that the London Posse and others had been doing so on a national scale for years already. I felt that a British accent was not authentic enough, perhaps not even black enough to be real hip-hop. Luckily, I got over this crisis within a week and have never rapped as if I were American since. Many of us have also chosen to adopt some of the destructive consequences of the Black American experience. The best two examples I can think of are the attempt to create Bloods and Crips style gangs in London and the uncritical adoption of the word nigger. Gangs have a number of sociological, economic, cultural and interpersonal sources. They do not arise in a vacuum, and the Bloods and Crips emerged directly in the wake of and fallout from Black American attempts at mass political self-organization during the 1960s. While there are certainly some economic and political similarities between Compton and Brixton, and there was certainly fallout from Black British attempts to self-organize in the 1980s, the adoption of colours in South London in the mid-2000s was as much an imitation of US corporate rap culture as it was the result of any directly collapsing political movements and deindustrialization. Of course, London's gangs, despite all media exaggerations, have come nowhere near the levels of violence of those in the USA, or those of Northern Ireland for that matter. But the fact that we chose to identify with West Coast American gangs rather than London's own centuries-long gang history, or even the infamous shower posse of Kingston and New York that had a presence in London during the 1990s, speaks volumes about how influential Black American culture had become. I make no secret of the fact that I used to use the word nigger in my music every other sentence, and indeed the only song of mine to get played on mainstream radio had the tagline, Shakespeare with a nigger twist. However, by my second album, I had all but given up using the word for a number of reasons. First, it made me extremely uncomfortable to have crowds of young white people scream nigger back at me, so that was just not going to work. Second, one of my elders gave me a bloody good talking to about its use. Shout out to Uncle Toyin. But lastly, I decided it was fake and destructive for us to call each other nigger and pretend it was a term of endearment. While they are our extended family, we are not Black Americans. We are Caribbean and African expats living in the UK. And I concluded, based on my studies of history, that while racism was everywhere, nowhere was the attempt to create this nigger, a figment of the white imagination, more intense, brutal, and long-lasting than in the USA. I came to feel that, even in the American context, the use of the N-word had become rather gimmicky, shorn of all original meaning and divorced from the context of its birth. The nigger, a fictional subhuman creation of the white racist imagination, a fiction that could justify actual humans being worked like beasts of burden, redlined, segregated, executed by law enforcement, experimented on by medical science, exhibited in zoos, bombed by their own government, having their towns torched by terrorists, and having to fight for almost a century to earn the right to shit in the same toilets as white people. All of that vanishes from view with the way nigger is now used in hip-hop. Now the nigger is presented as an autonomous black creation, a self-styled ghetto godfather, rather than as the echo of white supremacist perversion and relative black powerlessness that it is. Young black boys and men know this to be true, despite what we may tell ourselves. No truly self-loving people celebrate their own death, especially not for the entertainment of the primary beneficiaries of that death. I often work in prisons where, as you can imagine, a large section of those I work with are young black men. Some of the work we do is around creative writing, and the young men write raps invariably filled with boasts about how many niggers they will shank and shoot. I don't judge them. How could I? I used to carry knives and I used to rap quite like that, even though I knew better. I simply asked them what they would think if I rapped about killing honkies. I remind them that my white family are poor, that we come from Scotland, that Glasgow is often more violent than London, and that 20 million plus Russians alone died in the white-on-white violence of the Second World War. Despite all of this, and without exception, all of the young black boys I have put this question to have one of two reactions. They either laugh out loud at the absurdity of rapping about killing honkies, or they tell me that it would be racist for me, a man of mixed heritage that used to rap about niggers, to rap about killing honkies. They can never explain a logical reason as to why that is the case, but the inference is clear. These young black men, like the world at large, value white life over black life. Though I do recognize the argument is slightly flawed in that even though I am technically mixed race, I am racialized as black, and thus it would still be perceived as a black man rapping about killing white people. It has nonetheless been a revealing experiment. I must confess, though, I am quite the hypocrite on this issue. And much else, of course. I still love so-called gangster rap, though I recognize the oddity of a black icon boasting about killing other niggers for the entertainment of little Hank in Milwaukee. Niggerishness can be a multi-billion-dollar commodity, as long as it makes no mention of its relationship to whiteness. It's not that I wish the word to be deleted, nor even that I wish people would stop saying it. As I mentioned, much of my favorite music ever is gangster rap, and I accept that for a whole host of reasons, violence is a fundamental part of human entertainment, from Shakespearean tragedies to Korean revenge cinema to mixed martial arts, all of which I also enjoy. It's rather that I wish there was a greater range of voices making their way into mainstream popular culture, as has started to happen again with the likes of J. Cole and Kendrick Lamar, and that I hope, out of respect for the ancestors and the struggles they fought, that the context and pain attached to that word is not drowned in a sea of pool parties and post-racial fantasy. It is also compelling that African and Caribbean music, that is, music made in a black context primarily for black consumption, does not use the word nigger. And even the most gangster of Jamaican dancehall artists can be found offering profound political analysis of Jamaica's class dynamics and the corruption of its elites, something that has been almost entirely absent from mainstream hip-hop over the past 20 years. It's equally interesting to ask why reggae music has made such obvious inroads right across Africa, over and above US hip-hop, despite not having anywhere near the same level of corporate backing. What would the effect be on black musical production if black Africans had the same disposable incomes as white Americans? How does the self-perception of black people in majority black societies affect their worldviews and cultural tastes, if at all? We may want to remember that after returning from his first trip to Africa, Richard Pryor announced that he would never call another black man a nigger, so long as he lived. Travelling around the continent, he marvelled at the fact that there were no niggers there, and added that in his time there, I have not said it, the word, I have not even thought it. While uttered in the guise of comedy, this might be one of the most profound reflections on the black condition ever offered. Richard Pryor understood instantly that the metaphysical category of the nigger could not possibly have the same meaning in Africa as it did in America. While the physical legacies of white supremacy in Africa are clear enough, from the skin bleaching to the colonial borders to the languages of government, or from the segregation that is still so apparent in the former settler colonies, the state of spiritual and cultural crisis that Pryor denotes with the appellation nigger simply does not seem to exist in the same way for Africans. Perhaps it's just diaspora romanticism, but I felt that same feeling when I first set foot on the continent. It's a quality that cannot be explained unless you have experienced both states. People who have experienced niggerization or lifelong racism often walk as if they are apologizing for their existence. It was only when I saw black people that did not walk that way that this became clear to me. To a degree, I also feel this same unquantifiable phenomenon in the Caribbean. There is a cultural and spiritual freedom that people have growing up in a place that they feel belongs to them and they belong to, however severe the material challenges in that place may be. It's worth mentioning that Pryor was among the pioneers of the artistic use of the word, which he used in his comedy to shock at a time when everyone was aware of the dehumanization implied by the word nigger. Yet, here he was, realizing what racism had done to the black American soul, how it had made nigger an acceptable denotation of actual human beings, and just how destructive that was. A friend of mine once told me a story that exemplified the importance of the way we use words and the images and ideas we attach to them. He comes from Brixton, though he is of Nigerian, specifically Yoruba, heritage. He has been to prison and all that jazz, and one day he was on the block with the youngers when the following ensued. He was lecturing the youngers about traditional Yoruba values he admitted to having violated by being on the roads and going to prison. He asked the group of young men he was talking to, also of Yoruba origin, to imagine themselves as black youths and tell them what associations went with being a black youth. He then asked them to see themselves as Yoruba men and asked them what associations went with that identity. The images they associated with each identity were diametrically opposed. When he asked them if they could see Yoruba men go into prison for selling crack or stabbing each other, they said no. When he asked if they could see a black youth doing those things, they all answered yes. Obviously, Yoruba men are perfectly capable of any number of behaviors in real life, but the automatic associations are nonetheless interesting. If black youth can carry such connotations for black youth themselves, how much more severe would the word nigger be? And how much worse might the perceptions of people that are not black youth themselves be? My friend is not a social scientist. Smart as he is, he barely finished school. But this exercise was a masterstroke, and I often wonder if the youngers in question have continued to ponder the profound insight they stumbled upon that day. US hip-hop has fundamentally shaped the attitudes, tastes, language, fashion, political consciousness, and general swag of my generation across racial and economic lines, though this affiliation is clearly most pronounced within the black community. However, today is a unique time to be a UK hip-hop artist. Since the birth of hip-hop, and for decades afterwards, UK industry gatekeepers at radio and TV pretty much ignored domestic MCs, with a few notable exceptions, always preferring to support US artists over and above rather than as well as local artists. I think this partly has to do with the simple fact that US hip-hop was plainly of better musical and lyrical quality, and it must be honestly acknowledged that the classic US hip-hop albums are still the benchmark, still the canon for anyone entering the field. However, the reasons are also deeper than simple musical quality and stem from the situation of black culture in Britain. We, as black Brits, recent migrants floating somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, not quite really Caribbean anymore, with newer arrivals from Africa itself, and certainly not American, but not yet confident enough to speak with our own voice, alienated from the nation in which we were born, found ourselves relegated even in our own tastes to a second-class blackness. We preferred authentic Jamaican reggae to the British Caribbean version, and we preferred authentic US hip-hop to UK hip-hop, unlike the French, who by the 1990s had developed a thriving domestic hip-hop scene with scores of successful rappers, producers, and directors. Why did something similar not occur in the UK during the 1990s, despite our much closer connection to the US, being both English speakers and having literal cousins in the States? Ironically, part of the reason is French nationalism. A drive to preserve the French language commands that 40% of music on national radio be in French, which gave a platform to French hip-hop in a way that was just not there in the UK. The British music industry, particularly in the area of urban, read black music, has mostly been happy to just import whatever the American parent corporations of the major labels are selling. Then, in the early 2000s, things started to change dramatically. It really began with a cable TV station called Channel U that would play pretty much any music video it was sent. While this sometimes meant that the quality was laughably bad, that was part of its appeal, and the channel nevertheless gave a regular nationwide platform to UK rappers like myself for the first time. Then the internet happened, and MC-based platforms like Fire in the Booth, SBTV, and Grime Daily took UK rappers and grime MCs to a national and then global audience, without the filtration system of the music industry. The results of this, both domestically and internationally, have been astounding. If you look at the reaction videos on YouTube to mine and other UK rappers' Fire in the Booths, you will find scores of Americans reacting to the lyrics. I also think that, as in France, nationalism is ironically at play in the UK, in that I don't think it's a coincidence that part of grime music's recent success has been underpinned by journalists' ability to claim it as an authentically British form of music, even if the truly British status of its dominant practitioners is still in question. Why is this important to this chapter? Because for the first time in my life, black British musicians and rappers in particular are able to communicate across the pond and indeed to the world without the direct interference of corporate media, YouTube and social media notwithstanding, and without the direct control of the apparatus of the UK music industry. The results of this so far have been very interesting. Through artists like Stormzy and Skepta, through dramas like Top Boy reaching a wide audience, through activist collaboration, mainly via Black Lives Matter, and through social media, Black Britain has joined the voices stirring culture and politics into the cauldron that is the Black Atlantic in a more sustained way than ever before. While the scholars of yesteryear, Hall, Gilroy, etc., and even our parents' music, Lovers Rock, and Rare Groove, were arguably of far greater quality than that produced by today's generation, they did not, unfortunately, have the internet. There have been pioneering, successful artists before, like Soul to Soul, and Smiley Culture had a #1 rapping in Cockney and Jamaican accents way back in 1985. But none of this led to a sustained slew of household names. Scores of rappers who, if born just a decade earlier, would have been told by some dickhead A&R, "We don't know how to market you," and thus relegated to the dustbin, now have viable solo touring careers, with the biggest ones selling out the nation's largest arenas. That it took the relative consumer freedom of the internet for this situation to arise is by no means a coincidence. Now that radio has lost a lot of its power, though by no means all, it's clear that audiences of all ethnic backgrounds want authenticity, talent, and rawness. And so, Stormzy, Skepta, Kano, JME, Giggs, Wretch, Lady Leisha, Wiley, in short, a whole bunch of black artists from the hood, have become the most popular MCs in the country without having to make the corny kind of pop music that an A&R would have told them was necessary to get on the radio back in the day. There has been no need to limit it to 1 or 2 urban artists at a time, just as there was never a need to limit the amount of skinny-jeaned white guitar bands. Young artists like Dave are now free to make searing critiques of the Prime Minister, as he did on his song Question Time, and not have to worry about getting on the radio because he can get millions of views and streams on Spotify and YouTube. His first headline tour sold out in a day. Older artists like Loki can make critiques of the war on terror, get millions of views on YouTube, and sell thousands of tickets, all without a label or radio play. That the 2 most successful UK MCs, Stormzy and Skepta, are both of West African rather than Caribbean heritage reflects a demographic shift within the black British population, away from Caribbeans being the majority, and away from the Caribbean-centric cultural orientation that was the norm when I was growing up. It also speaks to a newfound self-confidence in British West Africans. These musical and cultural sea changes have led to a vastly different perception of Britain in the US. When I first visited New York in 2001, I went to stay with my friend's cousins in the Bronx. I spent time hanging out on the block there, and people noticed my obvious hip-hop swag, but would then be thoroughly confused when they heard a British accent. It was not unusual to be asked, "Yo, are there black people in England?" Or, "Do you know the Queen?" Of course, the latter question is just silliness, but the former reflects a genuine ignorance. After all, how would an American in 2001 have possibly known that there were over 1 million black people living in the UK? Certainly, they would not have garnered this from the UK's cultural output. But when I travel to the US these days, New York included, no one asks me such questions anymore, and people seem aware that there is a hip-hop scene, a black population, and even hoods over here in the UK. Even the largest American online hip-hop platforms, like The Breakfast Club, Vlad TV, and Sway, have recognized this changing trend and have had UK guests on their shows. When I was growing up, it seemed that our bigger, cooler American cousins were not even aware we existed, let alone how much we looked up to them. Now, a transatlantic dialogue facilitated by the web is starting to change the one-way flow of culture and perspective, and is producing some interesting currents. Even though we very much admire our black American cousins, we are not punks either, and some signs of natural conflict have started to arise as a result of these transnational black dialogues. In 2012, I was at the Hay Festival of Literature and the Arts, sat among a huge audience watching Sing Your Song, the documentary about the life of legendary civil rights activist and singer Harry Belafonte. After the documentary had finished, Harry came on stage to rapturous applause and took his seat next to the Labour MP David Lammy, who would interview him post-screening. I don't recall that much of the interview, but I remember Harry's typically charismatic recounting of near-death experiences during the civil rights struggle, his reflections on married life, and much more, as you would expect to come from such a discussion and such a life. However, When the questions passed to the audience, something strange occurred that has really stuck with me. Harry's discussion with David had touched on mass incarceration and the structural pathologies America is still enforcing so many decades after the days when Harry stood shoulder to shoulder with Dr. King. During the questions, the only other black person I could spot in the audience, it is Hayon White after all, got up to ask a question. She put it to Harry that Black Britons were even more disproportionately incarcerated vis-à-vis their white countrymen and women than Black Americans, and asked for his thoughts on that fact. To my shock and disappointment, rather than engage with the sister around a critical examination of transatlantic white supremacy, it was British colonists that set in motion America's racial governance, after all, Harry told her that she was wrong, that no one was as disproportionately locked up as Black Americans, and though I can't recall his exact words, he essentially brushed off her point as if it were ridiculous and made no attempt to draw any parallels between the US system of racism and that of the UK, despite their obvious historical connections. I won't go as far as to say that he suggested that there is no racism in the UK, but given the time and place, that was certainly how it felt. The sister was, of course, correct. While Black Americans are far more likely to be incarcerated than Black Brits because America locks up its population in general at far higher rates than Britain, Black Britons are 7 to 9 times more likely, the data fluctuates, to go to prison than their white co-citizens, and they are treated more harshly at every stage of the criminal justice system in the UK. While we are here, it's worth noting that Indigenous Australians are, in absolute terms, even more disproportionately incarcerated than Black Americans. This is not to negate, contrast, or compare, just a statement of fact that should be more known. Anyway, I was really enraged by Harry's dismissal and felt an urge to stand up and shout out in support of the sister, and in hindsight, I'm kind of angry that I did not. Here we had a civil rights legend being applauded by an overwhelmingly white British audience for his truly quite remarkable history of anti-racist activism. A man with credibility and stature, a contemporary and friend of some of the giants of American culture, lacking local knowledge, and therefore dismissing a valid concern. I'm sure it was just ignorance on Harry's part, but it did feel a little like he had put an uppity Negro back in her place. I could tell from how the sister's demeanour shrank at Harry's response that she felt it too. Surely if the audience in question were truly genuine in their anti-racist convictions, they would have been only too thrilled to have a man of Harry's stature offer strategies for tackling the institutional racism of their own society. As it was, this potential exchange was missed. Of course, I cannot speak for nor generalize about that audience, but knowing British politics, I can make some educated guesses, and it is fascinating to note that it was one of 2 black people in the crowd that offered the only question that drew those parallels. As I looked around the room, I thought about how much there was to unpack in this one little event that spoke to the contradictions of race and white supremacy in the US and the UK. On the one hand, you have the long tradition of British liberals showering praise on Black American activists from Martin to Ali to Baldwin and even sometimes Malcolm. British media has consistently made great documentaries on the heroes of the civil rights movement, praising their courage, and they were even invited into the hallowed halls of the British Academy at a time when black British faces were all but absent from them. You see, for much of Britain, America is where racism happens. And Britain is then, by definition, not racist because, it's not as racist as America. This is a totally moot and rather idiotic point, as no 2 countries have the same history, and thus no 2 countries have the same systems of social control. Thus, no 2 countries in essence have the same racisms. While British liberals may praise all the Dr. Kings in the world, this does not necessarily stop them from reproducing and or administering the domestic racial hierarchy effectively. For this reason, most people in Britain, if they know anything about racial injustice at all, are likely to be far more well aware of American issues and history than those on their doorstep, and this includes black people. They are more likely to know of the Alabama church bombing than of New Cross, more likely to know the name Rodney King than Cynthia Jarrett, more likely to know Jesse Jackson than Bernie Grant. It's a shame that Harry was ignorant of the facts, but to me his reluctance to even engage with Britain's racism seems to reflect a larger trend of some successful and well-off black Americans who conclude, based on their privileged experience alone, that Europe is some kind of racial paradise. The most famous of these would be other greats like James Baldwin and Richard Wright, who understandably fled to Paris to escape US racism. And the most recent was Samuel L. Jackson, who went on Hot 97 radio in New York in 2016 and ranted about black British actors taking American jobs, during which he suggested that black Brits essentially don't know what racism is because over there they've been interracial dating for 100 years. He also suggested Hollywood was hiring black British actors not because of their talent or quality, but because they cheaper than us, man. There is no need for me to explain why Samuel clearly knows nothing about black British history, and obviously does not care to, but it is curious that he did not seem to have had a problem with Denzel Washington playing Steve Biko, Danny Glover and Sidney Poitier playing Nelson Mandela, Jill Scott playing a South African, Don Cheadle playing a Rwandan, or Forrest Whitaker playing Idi Amin. Daniel Kaluuya, the black British actor Samuel was complaining about, was born to Ugandan parents and played a fictional black American in the film Get Out. Forrest Whitaker played probably the most famous real-life Ugandan, but for Samuel, this went unnoticed. Ironically, Daniel Kaluuya had to sue the Metropolitan Police in 2013 for dragging him off of a bus, putting him face down with their boots in his neck, and then taking him to the station and strip-searching him because he fit the description of a reported criminal. Daniel was already a fairly successful, award-winning actor at the time this happened, having appeared in the hit teen drama Skins. It is utterly inconceivable that a famous white British actor would be treated this way, obviously. So Samuel's comments just reek of American exceptionalism in blackface. According to Uncle Samuel, black Americans are apparently qualified to play Africans, Caribbeans, or any other black person on the globe, but Lord forbid any mere non-American should play a US role. Samuel also had an issue with David Oyelowo playing Martin Luther King. Black South Africans could equally suggest that black Americans don't really understand racism, poverty, and violence, and therefore Denzel is not qualified to play Steve Biko because things were not as bad in America as they were in apartheid South Africa. But this would, of course, be just as idiotic. Most strangely for an actor of his undeniable quality, Samuel seems to have totally forgotten that acting is literally pretending to be someone you are not. I am sure he has never lived on another planet, nor been part of an intergalactic expedition, yet he took up his role in the Star Wars franchise without a second thought. The idea that black people and white people interracial dating is evidence of the absence of racism reveals a surprisingly juvenile understanding of how racism works for a man of Samuel's age and brilliance. In Brazil, interracial dating goes back centuries, yet only a fool could possibly suggest that this has brought Brazil even close to overcoming its racism. In fact, it is frequently invoked to avoid dealing with it at all. Samuel's rant was not really that far off your stereotypical white bigot complaining about foreigners coming over here and taking our jobs. And it's really odd that he had not bothered to ask himself why so many black British actors are going to America in the first place. Other than the obvious existence of Hollywood, it's worth looking at the kinds of opportunities available for black British actors domestically. What kind of roles was Idris Elba playing before he went to the States and became Stringer Bell? Could it be that the black British acting exodus is partly reflective of the limited range of opportunities for diverse roles for black talent, and the lack of black directors and writers like Jordan Peele, who made Get Out, or other institutional challenges that you would have thought a black American of Samuel's age would have been able to relate to? He was totally uninterested in these questions, sadly. On the other side of this nationalist nonsense, black British actress Cush Jumbo claimed that black Brits were getting these roles in Hollywood because we are better than the Americans. Denzel, Viola, and Samuel himself are obvious proof that this is not true, and nor should we be in some paranoid and stupid competition with black Americans. Another black American great, Maya Angelou, told The Guardian in February 2012 that black Britons don't have the same spirit as black Americans. In all fairness to Mama Maya, it was a comment in an article about her extremely favourable views on Barack Obama. So who knows how exactly she intended it, but the inference seemed totally clear to me. Black Americans are somehow better, braver, stronger, more spiritual. A spiritual comparison between Black Britain and America is a ridiculous and ahistorical one. Black Americans have 4 centuries of shared history on American soil. Black Brits, for the most part, migrated from multiple countries across the British Commonwealth and beyond in various periods throughout the past 70 years. And thus, the fact that we have managed to meld any sort of coherent black struggle at all, given our diverse origins and differing histories, is actually remarkable. But if we expand the scope to the spirit of the black people of the British Commonwealth/Empire, we start to find figures like Marcus Garvey, Bob Marley, and Kwame Nkrumah, and some of the largest slave rebellions in human history. So, no lack of spirit at all then. Another brilliant black American, Ta-Nehisi Coates, followed his idol, the great James Baldwin, in romanticizing Paris in his book Between the World and Me, which no doubt surprised black and brown Parisians no end. The Paris of the 1960s was no racial paradise, with the 1961 massacre of some 40-plus Parisian Algerians during Algeria's war for independence and the clear segregation of that era. Nor is the Paris of today anything close to a racial utopia. It's strange that anyone could visit Paris and fail to notice the visible racial segregation of the African and Caribbean French population ghettoized in Bronx-style housing projects. It's even stranger that these obvious things could escape some of the most perceptive and insightful black Americans writing specifically about racial injustice. One could be forgiven if these romantic insights were about London, where on the face of it, the segregation is not so visible unless you go to the prisons. But for Paris, nothing of the sort could be argued, even at a glance. Middle-class black African diplomats studied at some of America's top universities back in the 1940s and 50s, and due to their nationality and class location, some of them had a great time in America. But that was hardly a representative black experience for the America of that period. It's not that these people are uniquely ignorant. Far from it. The people I just mentioned are all incredibly smart people. It's that power and prosperity can blind us all, and I'm sure that there are insights I have missed or faux pas I have made while traveling that someone operating from a different social location or with more local knowledge might have noticed or been sensitive to. It really should be unsurprising that wealthy black American artists and writers who travel to Europe for work and are surrounded there by well-off, probably well-educated, likely liberal-minded white Europeans who are fans of theirs would not experience the sharp end of European racism. The obvious mistake these people made is to universalize the experience of the privileged foreigner. I might conclude from staying in 5-star hotels in Manhattan, which I also did on my first trip to NY, that New York is a multicultural and incredibly wealthy paradise. I have, however, spent enough time in the Bronx since to know that's not the case. What's more, upon encountering American police, I have literally seen them breathe a sigh of relief when they hear my British accent and realize that I am not one of their Negroes. What is most sad for us is that these black American icons are our icons too. We view their slights in exactly the same way as black Americans would were these comments directed at them, i.e., as one of our own, dissing us, quite like Bill Cosby's infamous respectability rants against poor black people in America. Of course, many black American academics and icons have engaged with the struggle during their time in the UK and Europe. For example, just 9 days before he died, Malcolm X visited Smethwick in the West Midlands, where there had been a history of racial segregation and where a Conservative MP had run the election slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." In short, I do not want the above to be seen as broad strokes of condemnation, but rather a thread that picks up on some contradictions and tensions that will continue as multiple black voices continue to arise. West Africans have made similarly ignorant generalizations about black Americans. British Caribbeans were very ignorant and mean to newly arriving West Africans when I was young, and so on. I am a Pan-Africanist, which means I am for cultivating a proper mutual understanding between the populations of Africa and its various diasporas, given that we face similar and connected historical challenges, to the extent that this is possible without being idealistic. The issues discussed here are some of the misunderstandings of class, location, and specific histories that are likely to resurface in our transatlantic dialogues. Black Americans have been and will continue to be the most culturally prominent, visible, and for now, the most prosperous black population in the world, located as they are in the center of today's only real empire, the richest nation ever. The situation for black Britons mirrors that of our US cousins, but in microcosm, in that we are obviously not any smarter than Afro-Brazilians or black French people, but the global prominence of the English language and our location in the other imperial power affords us a global audience that Afro-Brazilians or black French people simply do not have. On the surface of things, a direct comparison between the black experience in Britain and America may seem totally superficial because the historical differences are so vast. Black Americans were enslaved in America, in the land where they now reside. So when slavery was reformed, not abolished, in 1865, they were subject to a whole century of overt and essentially state-approved violent and legislative terrorism, both after and during the brief period known as Reconstruction. This terror reached its apex in the 4,000-plus spectacle lynchings that occurred in the early part of the last century, exhibiting some of the most fantastical savagery in the annals of history, which were often watched by thousands of white people, including children, in a picnic-like atmosphere. Eggs and lemonade were consumed, commemorative postcards were created, and the body parts of black people that had been roasted alive, castrated, and carved into pieces were kept as souvenirs. Clearly, nothing like this kind of white supremacist terrorism has occurred in 20th century domestic Britain. There was also no formal segregation in the UK, by which I mean there were no laws officially preventing black people from voting, from renting houses where they chose to, and from enrolling in whatever state-funded schools they lived within the catchment area of, though some MPs did openly call for a colour bar. British Caribbeans came to the UK voluntarily, on their own purse, and as British citizens exercising the rights inherent in that citizenship. Post-war Britain adopted the principles of social democracy, meaning that the death penalty was abolished in 1947 and that all British citizens, regardless of colour, had access to higher education, healthcare, and a degree of social security. This means that the state cannot racialize these institutions, the death penalty, healthcare, and education, in the same way and to the same degree as the United States, thus eliminating some of the material basis for the most extreme racism. Black Brits emigrated into a society with an already established white underclass, and were mostly dumped in areas where that underclass already lived. Black Americans and the indigenous peoples were the foundation of the US underclass. So a comparison between British and American racism seems ludicrous then, doesn't it? Well, not so fast. Yes, domestic Britain's social democratic racism is certainly quite distinct from America's formal and then de facto apartheid. However, once we expand our scope to include the entire British Commonwealth, the situation looks quite different. As you saw in the chapter on empire, during the same years that Americans were enjoying their lynching picnics, Britain had put hundreds of thousands of British Kenyans into concentration camps and engaged in brutality every bit as savage as the American South. While South African apartheid has usually been associated with the Afrikaner-led National Party and its rise after 1948, Britain played a key role in originally developing South African apartheid. Yes, black Brits emigrated from the Commonwealth freely, but their migration cannot be divorced from the neo-colonial economics and deliberate underdevelopment in which the British state is implicated. Even within that migratory history, we can glean that race was every bit as important to Britain's rulers as it was to those of the USA in the post-war era. British governments were just rather more subtle about it. Yes, there was no formal segregation on British soil, but the post-war British government spent tens of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to bring European migrant workers and refugees to Britain, while working extremely hard to limit the number of non-white British citizens from the Commonwealth that could come to Britain, even though that was their legal right, and even though they, unlike the European refugees arriving at the same time, were paying for themselves. Additionally, Westminster encouraged the white dominions to keep their whites-only immigration restrictions, even though the entire Commonwealth had fought the Nazis together. The reason for this was, without a shadow of a doubt, about ruling class racism and nothing else. Even within domestic Britain, there have been some striking parallels between the Black British and Black American experience, most obviously seen with the aforementioned disproportionate incarceration and suspicious deaths in police custody, though of course the scale of both problems is far, far greater in the US. Within media, and among Britain's senior politicians, a social Darwinian racial explanation for crime has taken root, one that was clearly borrowed from American parlance. The issue of so-called black-on-black violence, or excessive melanin syndrome, if you will. As former Prime Minister Tony Blair put it, what we are dealing with is not a general social disorder, but specific groups or people who, for one reason or another, are deciding not to abide by the same code of conduct as the rest of us. The black community, the vast majority of whom in these communities are decent, law-abiding people horrified at what is happening, need to be mobilized in denunciation of this gang culture that is killing innocent young black kids. But we won't stop this by pretending it isn't black kids doing it. I'm unsure who these people Mr. Blair was referring to are, those that apparently pretend black people don't ever kill, but I am yet to come across them. No one is more familiar with black people's capacity to kill than other black people, if by virtue of nothing else but proximity. This narrative of a uniquely black criminality became so strong in the London of my youth that a special police department was set up to tackle black-on-black violence. A person could take a totally superficial look at America without reference to history, see the horrendous violence in Chicago, and start a simplistic narrative about black-on-black crime. But the fact that this narrative has become so deeply embedded in British media, policing, and political discourse just looks unbelievably bizarre when viewed nationally. When I was growing up, part of Britain was a war zone. Until the 1998 Good Friday Agreement brought an end to what is known as the Troubles, thousands of people had been killed in Northern Ireland as a result of the conflicts there. Even during the 1990s, the Troubles included multiple shootings and bombings that killed scores of people, including the 1998 bombing by the UVF that killed the three Quinn brothers aged 9, 10, and 11. If you ask someone why Northern Ireland, or indeed Glasgow, was so violent, they would almost certainly give you a history lesson in both cases. One about the British Empire and its legacies in Ireland in one case, and the resultant conflicts between Catholics and Protestants there, and the other, an interlinked story about the legacies of class neglect and deprivation in what was one of the poorest parts of Western Europe, the housing schemes of Glasgow. Neither of these explanations would be making excuses for the violence of either region or the peoples there, but simply be trying to give some context for one of the most complex human phenomena: murder. Given that the historically most violent regions of the UK had virtually no black population at all, and given that working-class youth gangs stabbing and shooting people had existed in Britain for well over a century, who do you think the gangs attacking our grandparents when they arrived were, you can imagine my shock when I discovered that there was, in the UK, such a thing as black-on-black violence. None of what occurred in Northern Ireland had ever been referred to as white-on-white crime, nor Glasgow, nor either World War, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, nor any conflict or incident of murder, however gruesome, between humans racialized as white. Despite hundreds of millions of white people killing each other throughout European history, witch hunts, mass rapes, hangings, torture and sexual abuse, and despite the fact that the two most violent regions of Britain in the 1990s were almost entirely white, there was no such thing as white-on-white violence. Yet apparently, working-class black Londoners had imported from America a rap-induced mystery nigger gene, similar to the slave sprint one, that caused black people to kill, not for all of the complex reasons that other humans kill, but simply because they are black, and sometimes because they listen to too much rap, grime, or dancehall. This is, after all, what the phrase black-on-black crime is designed to suggest, is it not? That black people are not like the rest of humanity, that they do not kill as a complex result of political, historical, economic, cultural, religious, and psychological factors. They kill simply because of their skin, their excessive melanin syndrome. The fact that yellow-on-yellow crime, mixed-race on mixed-race crime, or white-on-white violence just sound like joke terms, but black-on-black violence has credibility, speaks very loudly about the perceived relationship between blackness and depravity in this culture. I could quote dozens and dozens of articles from the 1990s from all sections of the British press carrying this thread of blackness and crime, but I won't bore you. What we should note, though, is that this style of reporting has changed very little in 3 decades. For example, on the 3rd of September 2016, Rod Liddell from The Spectator wrote an article with the headline and subtitle, "Why Don't Black Lives Matter Want to Ban the Notting Hill Carnival? Protesters would do well to focus on black crime, but they don't and they won't." Beneath the headline is a gruesome photo that presumably was taken at that year's carnival, of a young man with a bloody blade in his hand looking directly at the camera, and in the background what appears to be another young man who he has just stabbed in the leg, with a crowd of scared and shocked onlookers who have clearly just run away from this conflict further in the background. What's fascinating is that both the stabber and the stabbed in this picture are both visibly mixed race. But of course, there is no such thing as mixed race on mixed race violence because these young boys kill only because of the black half of their genetics. Stupid. Presumably, only their black halves go to prison and or die too, which is great news for me. The writer goes on to argue that Black Lives Matter UK should apparently protest Notting Hill Carnival because it's a greater danger to black people than the police. That year there were 5 stabbings, according to the article. The idiocy of this line of argument is so juvenile that I'm not sure I should even patronize you by bothering to deconstruct it, but I will, despite myself. Black Lives Matter protest a history of racialized violence in the USA, Britain and elsewhere, where white vigilantes and police literally get away with killing black people because in the not-so-distant past, black people were thought to be and legally classified as subhuman. In the case of the USA, these killings are often caught on camera. If white police officers and or vigilantes went to prison when they killed black people on camera, there would be no Black Lives Matter movement. Thus, the article destroys its own flimsy argument by pointing out that there were 400 arrests that year at Carnival, presumably including that of the young man who is glaring at us with a bloody knife in his hand in the picture. And therein lies the point. The young man will be arrested. If the person he stabbed died, with such convincing photo evidence, he will almost certainly go to prison for murder. But no matter how many police in America get caught on camera shooting people, or how many police in Britain have verdicts of unlawful killing returned against them, almost none of them will go to prison, or even so much as lose their jobs. There is an even more sinister suggestion coming from these "why don't black people protest black on black crime" journalists. The idea that all black people are implicated in the actions of all others. That if a single black human kills another, anywhere at any time on the planet, then the rest of us lose our right to protest systemic state injustice or any racist wrong done to us, for that matter. Would these white people like us to turn this argument around on them? Somehow, I doubt it. But it is notable that displays of transatlantic black solidarity narc so many people. Where does all this leave us? What are the prospects for any kind of revived black-led justice movements? What new cultures might emerge from the new interactions between Britain's inner cities and those of America? In what ways might the Black Atlantic evolve in the coming years? Any practical Pan-Africanism, to my mind, must also recognize difference and diversity. It's no good saying anti-black racism exists, so black people must become a simple monolith. While Black America's particular racial history has produced a political tradition that cannot in any honest way avoid centering the black-white dichotomy, it's understandably hard to convince our Igbo homies that fled Biafra or those that fled the civil war in Sierra Leone that mighty whitey is the sole, or even in many cases the primary, issue. It's notable that while Black American political scholarship has been grounded in critiquing race and white supremacy, continental African scholars and activists, who obviously understand the legacies of colonialism and white supremacy just as well as anyone, have chosen, as is proper, to also focus their critiques on the failures, greed, corruption, and murder of Africa's own ruling elites. Can we, the Caribbean and Black American descendants of racist chattel slavery who have been made black, tell the Yoruba people, of whom there are almost 50 million, that they must simply forego their specific ethnic history of over 2,000 years in favor of a simplified black solidarity, simply because racism exists? Should Jamaican Rastas ignore the history of religious persecution, police brutality, and class snobbery they have suffered in Jamaica, simply because we are all black? Or will the approaches and dialogues have to be more subtle and nuanced? As Black Britain becomes majority West African, how important is it not to forget the battles that the first generation of post-war Caribbean migrants and their children fought so that later black migrants would not have to? Can Black America incorporate the very different political traditions and experiences of the Caribbean and West Africa? And how does this entire conversation relate to the human situation as a whole and the inequalities, conflicts, and challenges facing everyone? Only time will tell. Chapter 11. The decline of whiteness, the decline of race, or the end of capitalism. Europe is no longer the center of gravity of the world. This is the significant event, the fundamental experience of our era. Akili Mbembe. Certainly, the dominance of the West already appears just another, surprisingly short-lived phase in the long history of empires and civilizations. Pankaj Mishra. It was 5 a.m. in Hong Kong, an hour I would normally consider to be the dead of night. But it was my first time in the city, and I only had 24 hours there, so I was eager to get up and about. I looked out of my hotel window to see the slowly rising sun, and to my shock, I was greeted by a vision of a whole city already coming awake. Scores of people were scurrying about as if it was the middle of the day, but they were clearly not on their way to work. I could see old couples doing Tai Chi on their rooftops, people going for walks, running, playing basketball, and meditating. Beyond the skyscrapers and the prosperity, the contrast of the green, mountainous beauty with the bustling city, the endless shopping malls and hotels, what stuck with me about Hong Kong was this early morning ritual. I had seen something similar a few weeks before when I visited Hanoi, and I thought it was a carnival day. But apparently not. It was just a typical Tuesday morning. It felt very strange to see people doing such unusual exercises. A few people were stick fighting. One guy in Hanoi had been practicing with a sword. so publicly and at such an early hour. Though I myself practice an Asian martial art and grew up watching kung fu films, what interested me was not the stereotype of ninja kung fu Asians being seemingly confirmed, but rather just how average everybody was. These were not Shaolin super Asians, but regular folks, including grandparents, mostly not of a great standard of training, but just trying to keep fit. And somehow, the early hour, combined with the sheer volume of people, struck me as politically significant. In my mind, this simple morning ritual spoke of a culture on the ascent, and I saw in it a togetherness that may well have been entirely absent for those that participated in it. This is when I accepted that everything the scholars were saying was true, that unipolar Western dominance was over, and that the return to preeminence, or at least to parity, of Asia awaited us. A couple of years later, the Beijing Olympics happened, and we all saw an opening ceremony that was so spectacularly impressive that you could almost not help but read it as China officially announcing to the world that the century of shame was well and truly over and that the Middle Kingdom was back to business as usual. There were little signs that the world could see this too. One day, I walked into the massive Foyle's bookstore on Charing Cross Road, and as I was staring at the shelf labelled The Classics, I noticed something strange. Up until now, the classics had always meant books written within the Western tradition. It did not matter that Africans and Asians had millennia of written literature too. Not anymore. On the shelf before me, I saw Chinese and Japanese classics like The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, The Tale of Genji, and The Water Margin. Times were changing. Less than a century ago, the Chinese in British-ruled Hong Kong lived in squalid, segregated ghettos and were governed by racist legislation. Today, the ethnic Chinese of Hong Kong are on average some of the richest people on the planet. How quick the pace of change in world affairs. When China was militarily and economically weak and politically fragmented by external and internal forces, Chinese people left China as exploited, indentured servants and found themselves on the receiving end of many of the same racist assumptions and discriminatory immigration legislation as other subject races. Today, you can check into any Park Lane hotel and you are as likely to see a Chinese guest as any other nationality. Over the past few decades, China has pulled at least 500 million people out of poverty. The communist propagandists at the World Bank actually put the figure at around 800 million. Industrialized at a pace faster than any nation before, and today stands at the leading edge of many green technologies. And it has managed to do all of this without invading and colonizing half the planet. For these and many other reasons, despite obvious and undeniable injustices in China, you would think China would be universally admired by those who claim to believe industrial capitalism to be the holy grail of human achievement. Yet, reading about China in the press, I can't help but feel a tinge of the old yellow peril sentiment still lurking beneath the narratives. And if the brilliant documentary filmmaker John Pilger is correct, the USA is already in the process of waging war on China. Watching The Coming War on China, his documentary on the subject, and looking at an image of the American military bases that surround China, and knowing a little history of US foreign policy, it's hard not to fear the worst. Under Barack Obama, the US government made it official that they were planning to pivot to Asia. And while of course the discourse is couched in suitably liberal language for public consumption, anyone with any kind of background in international relations, including the more honest American analysts, know that ultimately this policy will be about containing China. Translation: America intends to continue dominating the world, regardless of what the majority of the world's people want. Remember that more people in the world see the USA as the greatest threat to world peace than any other country. And this is according to results from American polling companies. before the election of that man that is currently in the White House. For example, a Gallup poll of 2014 asked 66,000 people from 65 countries which nation they thought was the greatest threat to world peace, and a quarter thought the United States, with just 6% saying China. This trend is echoed in earlier polls. While this obviously has not been a book about China, what I have tried to show is how globe-shifting forces, ideas and events, well beyond our individual control, shape the lives and times of individuals like you and me, and consequently determine a certain degree of our experiences, however much we might like to believe that we are in control of our lives. How the West in general, and Anglo-America in particular, will react to a nascent Asian power and prosperity, how they will contest global trade and military relationships will be one of the key drivers of questions about race and class in the 21st century. Just as the Cold War shaped race and class relations in the mid-20th century, and just as European geopolitical dominance in the 19th century made white supremacy a credible way of understanding the world for so many. Now that Europe is no longer the center of gravity in world politics or economics, and now that the biggest Western power is pivoting to Asia, no prizes for guessing where that means the US is pivoting away from, how will Western Europeans react to dropping to third place behind Asia and the USA in economic and military terms? How will American politicians and military personnel react when faced with the choice of preserving American power through alliances with Japan and India against China, or being loyal to their European cousins? If you've read enough political history, the likely answer to that one seems fairly obvious. It's easy to see how, in the 21st century, the very idea of race, and even Western society itself, could easily come apart at the seams. Similarly, from a Pan-Africanist perspective, how will successful black Westerners react to this changing world? Will we maintain emotional links with the interests of the global South beyond the generation or two, or will we fall into the trap of the black bourgeoisie that black American writer Franklin Fraser famously lamented way back in 1957? Will relative comfort and privilege change us for the worst? When all of the Caribbean and Indian-born post-war generation are dead, as will soon be the case, and we are just British people, how will this affect our political consciousness? I say we because I make no pretensions to superhumanity, and I wrestle every day with my own doubts, weaknesses, egotism, and greed. I often look at the world and just think, fuck it, why bother? But I know that's how we are supposed to feel. That's why the corruption is so naked and freely visible, to wear down people who have the conviction that things could be better. There is a picture of several Indian women in saris I often use in one of my lectures about perception. The women appear to be in their 50s and thus would usually be referred to as aunties. An Indian auntie might conjure images of a wise older woman preparing a delicious biryani with a secret recipe that, despite years of observing auntie at work, her British-born younger relatives just cannot replicate. The image of a Jamaican grandmother is not entirely dissimilar, for if there is anyone that has come to represent love, caring, great cooking, and wise familial authority, it is the grandmother or auntie. When I show this picture to an audience, I ask them to add a caption that will tell me what is happening in the picture. Students are invariably aware that some kind of trick is at play, but nonetheless, a flurry of hands go up with the usual assumptions. They are at a wedding. Auntie has just shared her secret biryani recipe with the family. It's Diwali. After these few guesses, the audience looks more intently at the picture and starts noticing the details. The men in the background wearing glasses. The fact that the women are in what looks like a classroom and not a kitchen. And eventually, the small screens in the distance that show faint images of satellites and planets, and the answer dawns on someone. "It's the Indian satellite mission to Mars," someone shouts, and a collective pause is followed by laughter as people realize the significance of the trick. This image may prove to be one of the most important metaphors for the 21st century. The picture features Sitha Somasundaram, the program director of the ISRO, Indian Space and Research Organization, Space Science Program, Meenal Rohit, project manager of the methane sensor for Mars, and Nandini Harinath, the deputy operations director for the Mars orbiter mission. These aunties in the picture, despite some sexist claims by internet trolls to the contrary, were some of the most senior scientists on the Indian mission Mangalyaan, a rocket that reached Mars in 2014, a feat which was achieved for around 10% of the cost of NASA's Maven rocket, which was launched just a week earlier. If there was one image that I could pick that sums up the stupidity of racism and sexism, the legacies of anti-colonial struggles, and the potential of all people to be brilliant, this might well be it. This image of older brown women leading the world in literal rocket science, an area of work so challenging that it has become the metaphor for intellectual difficulty. The 21st century could well turn out to be a shit century in which to be a bigot, clinging to old assumptions of gender, race, and the eternal supremacy of a particular culture or geographic region. Or, alternatively, old hierarchies might well continue to reassert themselves. But the fact that India has achieved this in less than a century of independence from Britain, and at a time when the country still has more desperately poor people than any other, only makes it all the more fascinating to contemplate what the future holds. The ancient Egyptians believed that their pharaoh was sacred, a representation of God on earth. Indeed, the very essence of monarchy is rooted in this religious idea of divine kingship. As long as Kemetic Egyptian civilization was strong and stable, technologically unparalleled by its contemporaries and militarily able to defend itself, this illusion of divine kingship may well have felt truly plausible. As someone who has been fascinated since childhood by ancient Egypt, I've always wondered how the people of that land might have reacted when they realized that their king was not so divine after all, that their land could be conquered by foreign barbarians, and that the universe offered them no preordained special treatment as a result of their monarch's relationship with the divine. One could even argue, as the Ghanaian Pan-Africanist scholar and novelist Kweyama has, that this belief actually paralyzed the ancient Egyptians and made them unable to cope with the reality check when it came. How else do we explain their ability to build complex structures that still puzzle modern engineers, alongside their failure to build a proper defensive fort across the thin strip of land through which the successive invaders that had constantly threatened the kingdom had come? In a sense, I think whiteness has functioned quite similarly to divine kingship, paralyzing those who are intensely invested, trapping them into a resentment of the reality that they are obviously not superior. For several centuries, people racialized as white were often taught, sometimes by some of the best minds in their societies, that they were inherently superior to other human beings, that they could disregard the feelings of their Negro slaves, their Indian subjects, and their vanquished mandarins without having to fear consequences because their supremacy was in fact eternal, preordained by God or science or culture. When major shocks to this system did come, people racialized as white were often unable to process what was occurring. During the Haitian Revolution, for example, the white French came up with all kinds of fantastical theories about the rebels being white people in blackface, rather than accept the obvious fact that their former slaves had risen against them, as human beings are likely to. This denial was best summed up by one French colonist who said, "All experienced colonists know that this class of men have neither the energy nor the combination of ideas necessary for the execution of this project, whose realization they are nevertheless marching towards." Similar racial reactions can be observed in response to Reconstruction in America and particularly the rise of Imperial Japan, which caused a diplomatic crisis in the Western world. The politicians of the time were very careful not to speak too openly about this racial anxiety, and historians have generally neglected this factor since. But a few scholars have taken the time to show us just how much impact the Pacific War had on the racial balance of world power. Despite a seemingly pervasive belief that only people of color play the race card, it does not take anything as dramatic as a slave revolution or Japanese imperialism to evoke white racial anxieties. Something as trivial as the casting of non-white people in films or plays in which a character was supposed to be white will do the trick. For example, the casting of Olivier Award-winning actress Noma Dumezweni to play the role of Hermione in the debut West End production of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child got bigots so riled up that J.K. Rowling felt the need to respond and give her blessing for a black actress to play the role. A similar, but much larger controversy occurred when the character Rue in the film The Hunger Games was played by a black girl, Amandla Stenberg. Even though Rue is described as having brown skin in the original novel, fans of the book were shocked and dismayed that the movie version cast a brown girl to play the role, and a Twitter storm of abuse about the ethnic casting of the role ensued. You have to read the responses to truly appreciate how angry and abusive they are. As blogger Dodai Stewart pointed out at the time, all these people read The Hunger Games. Clearly, they all fell in love with and cared about Rue, though what they really fell in love with was an image of Rue that they'd created in their minds, a girl that they knew they could love and adore and mourn at the thought of knowing that she's been brutally killed. And then the casting is revealed, or they go see the movie, and they're shocked to see that Rue is black. Now, this is so much more than, oh, she's bigger than I thought. The reactions are all based on feelings of disgust. These people are mad that the girl they cried over while reading the book was some black girl all along. So now they're angry. Wasted tears, wasted emotions. It's sad to think that had they known that she was black all along, there would have been no sorrow or sadness over her death. The film and play examples may seem trivial, and it's easy for most sane people to denounce such idiocy, but the racial reactions to Reconstruction, civil rights, decolonization, and the rise of Japan were anything but trivial, and I sincerely doubt that the reactions to the return of China and what that means for world affairs will be trivial either. I believe to some extent we are living through another crisis of whiteness, perhaps the final one, and that this crisis is tied up with several other complicated political and historical threads, such as the looming ecological disaster, domestic class conflict, Islamic fascism, the pivot to Asia, and, if the Marxist scholars are correct, the very end of capitalism itself. Though I am aware that capitalism's inevitable end has been predicted ever since its beginning. Recent events in Anglo-America cannot but compel us to reflect on all of these threads. I am no fan of Barack Obama and recognize that he was, in essence, beyond the Kenyan dad, the beautiful black family, the singing of Al Green, and the fist bumps, not substantially different from other US presidents in that he continued America's wars, arms industry, deportation procedures, drone program, and general global aggression. But we cannot help but reflect on the election of the man that has succeeded him. It is notable that white supremacist groups cheered the election of Obama in 2008, as they hoped and believed that the racist backlash would support their agendas. They were not mistaken. The election of Donald Trump, a reality TV star with no previous political experience and a man openly endorsed by neo-Nazis, white nationalists, the KKK, and other beacons of light, has been sold to us even by some notable white leftist and liberal commentators as a rebellion against the status quo, the rage of an apparently forgotten group of Americans. These people seem to know nothing about American history or race politics, or worse, they are choosing to cover for white supremacists. In either case, their views are not supported by the data at all. The idea that economic anxiety was the key driver of Trump's election simply melts into thin air when we recognize that the poorest Americans, black and indigenous, did not support Trump in any great capacity. In fact, the average Trump voter earned twice the median salary of the average black American, yet less than 10% of black Americans voted for Trump. As writer Ta-Nehisi Coates caustically points out, Trump won white women, +9, and white men, +31. He won white people with college degrees, +3, and white people without them, +37. He won whites aged 18 to 29, +4, 30 to 44, +17, 45 to 64, +28, and 65 and older, +19. Trump won whites in Midwestern Illinois, +11, whites in Mid-Atlantic New Jersey, +12, and whites in the Sun Belts New Mexico, +5. In no state that Edison polled did Trump's white support dip below 40%. Hillary Clinton's did in states as disparate as Florida, Utah, Indiana, and Kentucky. From the beer track to the wine track, from soccer mums to NASCAR dads, Trump's performance among whites was dominant. According to Mother Jones, based on pre-election polling data, if you tallied the popular vote of only white America to derive 2016 electoral votes, Trump would have defeated Clinton 389 to 81. There are multiple studies, including a Gallup one involving a huge sample of 125,000 Americans, that simply dispel the myth that economic hardship was the determinant factor for Trump's election. A factor? Sure. The factor? No way. The determining factor was whiteness. And as Coates explains, to accept that whiteness brought us Donald Trump is to accept whiteness as an existential danger to the country and the world. While I do not accept the logic that Trump is a danger to the world, but Obama was not, American foreign policy is a danger to the world, full stop. And while I do not buy into the hysteria that sees Trump as a radical break with American history, I must admit I was still surprised by his election. I expected Clinton to win and to continue the mundane, run-of-the-mill, democratic white supremacy and classism where unjust deportations, millions of citizens lacking healthcare, chronic homelessness, bombing random brown countries, cheering for the torture and execution of foreign heads of state without even a sham trial, mass incarceration, and the disproportionate execution by police of unarmed black civilians continue to be American norms. But Trump won. And while not every Trump voter is a card-carrying Nazi, they are totally fine with a president whose white supremacist sympathies were entirely plain long before he took office, and have only become clearer in the time since. The good news to keep in mind is that half of eligible adult Americans did not vote at all, and that had Bernie Sanders won the nomination, there is good reason to believe he could have beaten Trump, and ultimately, Mr. Trump actually still lost the popular vote. However paradoxical it may seem, Trump's election, horrendous as its effects will certainly be for millions of Americans, may turn out to have some unintended positive long-term effects. I know you probably think I have gone crazy here, so bear with me. If Trump's White House does not start a nuclear war, something a president certainly cannot do all by himself, despite what you may have seen in the movies, the election of a reality TV star that makes spelling mistakes on his Twitter and retweets the likes of Britain First puts white supremacy so obviously and nakedly in the spotlight that people are simply forced to confront it. At the time of writing this, Trump has not yet had his state visit to the UK. Yet by the time you read this, he will have, And I bet the protest against his presence to the most odious side of America and to at least a certain aspect of the special relationship was huge, wasn't it? I detest the policies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, but I cannot deny they were both brilliant men, incredibly intelligent, charismatic, competent, and confident. Even someone that sees Anglo-American foreign policy as the greatest threat to world peace, as I do, along with a quarter of humanity, could easily be taken in by men of their quality. Trump's election, on the other hand, may well have woken up Western liberals to the dangers posed to the future of humanity by unchecked white supremacist grumblings, dangers the rest of the world have long since known. But maybe I'm just trying to see the best. Maybe the next 3 years will bring us ever closer to the brink of nuclear war. Maybe Trump pulling the country out of even limited frameworks of international peace and cooperation, such as UNESCO, the Paris Climate Accords, and the UN Compact on Migration, will do irreparable damage to the world and make Obama and Clinton look wonderful in hindsight. But as I watched the Trump inauguration on a TV screen in Addis Ababa, it all looked so satirical that I could not help but see the signs of an empire in decline. The question, then, is how painful might the fall be? America's great contradiction is that it is, in some respects, a successful multiracial polity, one that has produced inspirational cultures of critical scholarship and art, often in resistance to the very white supremacist underpinnings of American ruling class ideology. But the most visible, celebrated and prosperous black people in the world also come from a country that has bombed multiple black and brown countries since 1945, and even its own citizens, and is home to a network of racialized prison labor camps unparalleled in human history. It's easy for people in Europe to look to America as the racist country, especially at the moment. But how will people in Europe react if and when their nations undergo similar demographic changes to those the US has? My guess is not very well. It is America's biggest contradiction that the country is perhaps the best example of a successful multiracial polity in the world today, and also a brutal white supremacist empire at the same time. Which of these trends shall win? Which brings us back to the UK. It's understandable, given the timing of the two campaigns, the central focus of both on demonizing immigrants, the close political relationships of Britain and America, and the particularly close relationship between Nigel Farage and the Trump administration, that so many people have conceptually linked Trump and Brexit, codenamed Trexit. Before we look at Brexit, I would like to make some obvious observations. By analysing the role that xenophobia and racism played in Brexit, a role much more ambiguous than in the election of Trump, I am not suggesting that everyone that voted Leave is akin to the Grand Wizard of the KKK, nor that Remain voters are a homogenous group of revolutionary anti-racists. This should be so obvious it should hardly need stating. But given our national immaturity around discussions of race, perhaps it does. I have met black socialists that voted Leave, I have met absolute xenophobes that voted Remain, and everything in between. The ruling class itself was massively divided on the issue, with the Murdoch press and Tony Blair, usually in such sublime agreement when it comes to waging war, occupying opposite camps. I myself am neither Remain nor Leave per se. As I wrote at the time, I think there are valid reasons to leave the EU, but I was driven to a Remain position by A, the xenophobic tone of the Leave campaign, though both sides were of shockingly poor intellectual quality, and B, an assessment of Britain's current political landscape. So while there were obviously multiple motivations around such a complex issue, what I do wish to emphasize, as a few others also have, is the role that race, xenophobia, anti-intellectualism, and ahistorical analyses played in the Brexit campaign, popular perceptions of it, and ultimately its outcome. We've heard it said repeatedly that leaving the EU will allow Britain to stop neglecting the Commonwealth. But those of us that actually come from Commonwealth countries tend to shudder when we hear this. Why? Well, Apart from the imperial history you read earlier, it's because what have we seen to reflect this newfound love for the Commonwealth in recent years? Immigrants go home vans trawling the streets of Tower Hamlets? I wonder who they were looking for. Anyone who has been to Tower Hamlets knows that they certainly were not looking for Swedish people or white New Zealanders. In 2015, David Cameron announced that the UK would be building a £25 million prison in Jamaica to rehouse Jamaican nationals currently in Britain's prisons. The problems with this were multifaceted. First, there are more Irish and Polish nationals in Britain's prisons, so why the focus on Jamaica? Second, there were only 700 Jamaican nationals in the UK's prisons anyway. So one may also question if the project is worth £25 million of taxpayers' money in a country that is already the most heavily incarcerated in Western Europe by quite some distance. Third, and perhaps worst of all, the Jamaican government responded to what was being reported and said that it was inaccurate and that no such deal had been signed, rather that discussions had just been opened. More recently, we have seen deaths at immigration detention centres and charter planes full of Jamaican nationals, Kenyans, Nigerians, Ghanaians and other Commonwealth nationalities, many of whom had spent decades here and had British children and British partners being sent back to countries that some of them had not visited since childhood. As you saw from the last chapter, Commonwealth migration policy has historically been defined much more by race than anything else. If the British government was serious about wanting to engage for the first time in a mutually beneficial relationship with the non-white parts of the Commonwealth, this is a strange way to go about it. Furthermore, there are now millions of Indian, Ghanaian and Jamaican Brits who could and would serve as natural mediators, trade partners and facilitators with their countries of origin. But to my knowledge, our experience, insight and ties to our nations of origin have not been sought out by these would-be Commonwealth lovers. If the British state's intentions for Africa and Asia are what they say they are, democracy, prosperity, peace and stability, it would surely welcome the input of those of us who obviously desire these things for our family and friends back home. When one examines the data around Brexit voting patterns and how they relate to geographic locations, age, ethnicity and party allegiance, it seems even harder to sell the idea that Commonwealth love was any kind of a motivating factor at all. According to the Lord Ashcroft exit poll data, 96% of UKIP voters voted Leave, hardly surprising. Control over immigration was cited as the second most important reason for voting Leave. Of the people who thought multiculturalism was an ill, 81% voted Leave. Of the people who thought immigration was an ill, 80% voted Leave. Of those who thought feminism was a force for ill, 71% voted Leave. Of the 30 areas with the most old people, 27 voted Leave. Of the 30 areas with the least university-educated people, 28 voted Leave. Of the 30 areas with the most people identifying as English, not British, all voted Leave. The Remain voter stats were almost an exact inverse and concluded that 71% of the people that thought immigration was a net good voted Remain. 71% of those that thought multiculturalism was a force for good voted Remain. 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted Remain. 61% of over 65s voted Leave. The regions of England that are multicultural skewed Remain. Those that are not skewed Leave. Despite all of the claims that economic hardship determined the result, as scholars Satnam Verdi and Brendan McGeever point out, while exit polls confirmed that around 2/3 of those who voted in social classes D and E chose to leave the EU, we should also note that the proportion of Leave voters who were of the lowest two social classes was just 24%. Leave voters among the elite and middle classes were crucial to the final outcome, with almost 3 in 5 votes coming from those in social classes A, B, and C1. Among black Brits, 74% voted Remain, the highest of any ethnic group. So what could explain this? Do black Britons, who are overwhelmingly working class, just love the EU? I would suggest not. Many black Britons are well aware that European unity, if not of course the EU itself, was fostered in no small part by the pan-European project of racialized enslavement and the joint scramble for Africa of the European powers. So it seems rather unlikely that an undying commitment to European unity is what drove this group. My suspicion is that a lifetime of being treated like immigrants in their own country generally makes black Brits quite sensitive to anti-immigrant rhetoric. Which brings us on to a question of nationalism. Why did the Northern Irish and Scots behave so differently to the English, even though their nations are much less ethnically diverse? How come the anti-immigrant fervour did not register in the same way in the lily-white parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland as it did in England? Clearly, in Northern Ireland, concern over the potential return of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic was a factor. But you can't say the same for Scotland. That England, a country not properly invaded since 1066, but which has invaded almost every nation on the planet, can have a party named the UK Independence Party win 13% of the national vote in 2015 speaks volumes about collective amnesia and ability to distort the facts. The ability of Britain to invade almost the entire planet, and then for a significant portion of the country to proclaim themselves victims of some kind of invasion or colonization, may well not seem directly racial, but it certainly echoes quite clearly the way white America, with its long-term history of racist pogroms, lynching, slavery, and segregation, has somehow emerged believing itself to be the victim of racial discrimination. Britain entered the EU freely. It has voted leave freely. The only blood that was shed around this issue was when a white supremacist, ultra-nationalist lunatic assassinated an MP perceived to be too kind to immigrants during the campaign. Hardly a country under siege like so many of those on the receiving end of Britain's imperial conquests. Which brings us onto the final point about Brexit. Immigration was central to the campaign and such an important issue for voters, but as Dr. Nadine El-Inani, senior lecturer in law at Birkbeck University, pointed out at the time, Britain had never lost control of its borders. Britain never joined Schengen, and not only continues to exercise border controls in relation to EU nationals, but also has a flexible opt-out from EU law on immigration and asylum, which it has consistently exercised to opt into restrictive measures that further strengthen its capacity to exclude, and out of those aimed at enhancing protection standards. In view of this, Britain's decision to depart from the EU, primarily over the question of immigration and border control, demands scrutiny. The Leave campaign argued that exiting the EU would allow Britain to take back control of its borders and would make Britain great again. The referendum debate was eclipsed by the topic of migration, and not exclusively that of European citizens. The epitome of the Leave campaign's scaremongering about migration was perhaps the moment Nigel Farage unveiled a poster depicting non-white refugees crossing the Croatia-Slovenia border in 2015 along with the slogan, "Breaking Point." We can look at the above demographics, remember that picture, and claim racial fear-mongering was not a central factor if we wish, but I sincerely doubt that if Farage had used a queue of scantily clad Russian models running across the border, that the breaking point line would have hit home in quite the same way. Perhaps the worst part about this whole debacle is that by now it should be abundantly clear to all that Brexit will pave the way for an even more extreme version of the Thatcherite sell-off of UK assets and services and the domination of the UK economy by US and transnational capital. It was not, To my mind at least, a choice between the EU and independence, but a choice between staying part of a flawed union or choosing to deepen ties with the American empire and continue the Americanization of the British economy. If Britons wish to learn what a US-style healthcare service looks like, they are free to talk to any poor American. Many scholars, particularly those of colour, have made a similar analysis of the whiteness of Brexit, and no doubt, persons racialised as white will accuse them of reading race into everything. But every so often, Britain's obsession with whiteness comes to the fore all by itself. The 2011 census revealed that people identifying as white British are now a minority in London. Almost every major newspaper ran an article on this revelation, asking what this meant for the future of the capital, though obviously in as racially muted language as possible. I remember hearing radio debates on the issue, and in all of the kerfuffle, no one mentioned something obvious. Lamenting this apparent decline in the white British population obviously asserts just how clearly we see whiteness and Britishness as being synonymous, which is usually something we deny. A decline in British Indians living in London would hardly be deemed newsworthy by every major paper. I take this moment to remind you that most immigrants that came to Britain, even before Britain joined the EU, came from Europe and were thus white. The good news is that, despite what all the doomsday white nationalists are saying, the mixing of the races has consistently worked not to reinforce interpersonal racism, but to undermine it. My home city being one of the best examples of this in the world. There are racists and bigots in London, for sure, and the power structures in London are racialised, without a doubt. But nonetheless, Londoners on the whole have clearly gotten used to people that are supposedly different. An attempt to recruit for a far-right party in Ladbroke Grove, Camden, or Lambeth would be a funny experiment to watch. The other funny thing about these doomsday reports of white decline is that while the papers in question would probably balk at the idea that white people are uniquely racist, this is what their narrative implicitly implies. We, so-called ethnic minorities, are just expected to live with difference and accept it. I never went to school with any other people who were Caribbean, Scots, English, but it did not kill me. These articles imply that, or at least ask if, white people are incapable of doing what British Indians, Ghanaians, and Cypriots have had to do in London, which is to get used to different peoples and cultures. Similar white decline demographic time bomb articles have been circling in US and European media for some years now. And this demographic shift is what white extremists are laughably labelling white genocide. In reality, it is only the threat of a continued reduction in white privilege, a potential sharing of global power, and the spread of equality before the law and the institutions of the state to people not racialized as white. In America, people racialized as white, whether they become a minority or not, will still hold virtually all of the key levers of economic, military, and political power. There are no groups I know of with a history of barbecuing white people in front of thousands and collecting their body parts as souvenirs. There are no black police officers refusing to treat white people as victims as they lie dying in the street, and then putting their families under surveillance when they campaign for justice. And there are no torture camps in the third world to which white citizens are deported to stay in for years without trial or due process. Though the threat from Islamic fascist terrorists is real enough, they are equally willing to kill black and brown people as white people. In fact, the vast majority of people killed by ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab have been in Africa and the Middle East, obviously. Thus, there is no reason for white populations to be any more afraid of or more willing to entertain a flat cultural essentialism about almost 1.8 billion Muslims than the rest of us. Though it's entirely understandable and human that a portion of the people racialized as white fear that if they become a minority, which means seeing whiteness as a defining factor, obviously, others will do to them as they have done to others. The idea of white racial victimhood, at this point at least, is laughable. So laughable that when you ask for specific examples of ways in which white people are victimized, for being white, if you get any answer at all, it is likely to be, people just assume I'm a racist. However, the narrative of white racial victimhood is very useful in class terms for the white ruling classes. By demonizing the undeserving ethnic other with whom poor whites have more materially in common, the upper classes can use a racial solidarity rooted in the history of dominating the other to mask a history and reality of exploitation. Those that instrumentalize race in this way generally could not give two shits about the chavs in Liverpool or the rednecks in Alabama. There is nothing even remotely resembling genocide happening to white people. If white people choose to have fewer children because they are more prosperous, a pattern we see repeated in other rich, non-white nations like Japan, that is totally their free choice. Similarly, white and non-white people voluntarily having sex with each other now that they are free of state-imposed apartheid laws or widely acceptable moral scorn, thus producing little mongrels like me, is hardly in the same conceptual universe as physical extermination. But that is how warped the white nationalist worldview is. As we watched the neo-Nazis march through Charlottesville chanting, "The Jews will not replace us," on their way to defend a statue of a man that fought a war to keep slavery, we are confronted by the lunatic contradictions of white supremacist identity. While claiming to be supreme, these people clearly do not believe what they are selling. For if Aryans are inherently superior, there would be no need at all to worry about Jews or niggers replacing them. Surely an innate Aryan supremacy should make them, by definition, irreplaceable. This constant articulation of supremacy and victimhood has long been a cornerstone of white supremacist discourse. Today, life in Western Europe, Australia, and North America is, by the material standards of the world and human history, really quite spectacularly wonderful, even for those of us that grew up poor. Europe has enjoyed an unprecedented level of peace and prosperity for the past 7 decades, free from the kinds of major conflicts that have defined so much of its history. You would think that today would be a time that Europeans, particularly those on the political right, would be celebrating the spectacular domestic success of their model of capitalism. For never before in European history has healthcare, education, peace, and prosperity been so widespread as it has in the era since 1945. Yet strangely, we find not optimism and dynamism coming from the European right, but rather a lament for the supposedly dying continent and the inevitable decline of the West, and even, at the extreme end of now acceptable paranoia, fear of an apparently imminent takeover by the Muslims. These thinkers are not particularly original, but rather are echoing an old refrain that goes back at least a century to writers like Oswald Spengler, Madison Grant, and Lothrop Stoddard, who bemoaned the decline of the West and/or the white race at the very time when white supremacy and Western preeminence were at the peak of their global power. But even the threat of Muslim terrorists starts to look far less daunting when viewed against the long and very recent history of violence in Europe, such as the British in Ireland, the IRA, ETA, Grappo, post-Franco right-wing militias in Spain and during Italy's Years of Lead, and certainly not like an existential threat to the continent's survival. The fact that the terrorism of Islamic fascists has been characterized as a failure of multiculturalism, but the equally murderous terrorism of the above groups was not, is in itself quite fascinating. In some ways, though, the decline of the West lot are correct in that the Europe they imagined is indeed doomed, because it never really existed in the first place. This lily-white Europe where everyone knew their place, things were peaceful and everyone got along, simply melts into thin air against the historical record of land clearances, the violence of nation-state formations, religious purges, anti-Jewish pogroms, the Habsburgs, Napoleon, a couple of world wars, and the Inquisition. But just because the supposed golden era never existed does not mean that people will not strive after it. On the 21st of January, 2017, the far-right parties of several major European countries met for the first time in the German city of Koblenz to outline their vision for a Europe of freedom, I am entirely unsure who it is Europe is colonized by and needs to be free of, but again, we see a clear articulation of a sense of victimhood. Very few, if any, of these parties espouse an easily recognizable, old-school, white supremacist discourse, for now. But when regional leaders in the German ADF party are talking openly about how Holocaust guilt has strangled Germany, we are already in the territory of Nazi apologia being acceptable in public discourse. These far-right groups were extremely explicit about the inspiration they took from the Brexit vote and Trump's victory in the US, with the French far-right politician Marine Le Pen calling 2016 the year the Anglo-Saxon world woke up, in reference to Trump's election, and the Dutch far-right leader Geert Wilders paraphrasing Trump's slogan after the Koblenz meeting by tweeting, "We will make our countries great again." Most of the animosity of these groups has so far gone towards Muslim immigrants, but black people who are not Muslims watch carefully, as we are certain that people willing to accept flat generalizations about 1.8 billion Muslims or wild theories about global Jewish conspiracies will invariably not be crying over a few dead black people. These groups and their ideas are not fringe, as liberals seem to wish they were, and liberalism seems to be entirely ill-equipped to meet and challenge them. It seems to me ridiculous to believe that there will not be major conflicts in the coming decades in Europe between the Muslim populations, far-right groups, and the state that will inevitably also have consequences for black and brown non-Muslims and for anyone else who just wants to live in peace. Burying our heads in the sand or pretending that Europe is now so enlightened and democratic that the pogroms against outsiders that have characterized so much of its history prior to 1945 cannot return is pure delusion. Think about it like this. Whilst people in Europe like to feel as if we, are so much more racially enlightened than the Americans, in almost all European countries, the percentage of the population that is not racialized as white is less than 5% of the total, though this is projected to increase sharply over the next generation. And yet we have all the racial fear-mongering, immigration detention, barely disguised, racially motivated migration legislation, and, in the case of France, visible and clear segregation. It's easy to point to America as the racist state, but how will Europe react to its changing demographics coupled with a relative loss of global power? We will soon see. On the other side of the world, how will Australians and New Zealanders adapt to the reality of their demographic location? Will they accept the inevitable reality that China, India, and Japan are likely to be their most practical business partners in the 21st century? Or will they cling to the notion that they are part of Britain's white dominions? Having visited both countries, I must confess, it's a little unfair to simply lump them together on this question. New Zealand seems to be further ahead than Australia in adapting to this rapidly changing world in terms of domestic race relations, yet Australia seems to understand its Asian location very well in business terms. The long-term demographic effects of business and trade relations with industrialized Asian economies are obvious enough. The key question, therefore, becomes this. What happens once money no longer whitens? When whiteness is no longer a metaphor for power? When whiteness is no longer default? When Chinese or Indian actors can be universal sex symbols in the way that Brad Pitt and George Clooney are thought to be? When the world's leading economies are decidedly in Asia? Whiteness will have to find a totally new meaning. This process is already well underway, and some of the problems we are seeing in the West discussed above are the pangs of people racialized as white getting used to this new world. It is one of the central arguments of this book that some of the major political currents in the Western world today must be understood through the racial reframing of the world, a reframing that has been taking place since 1945 and only looks like accelerating in the years to come. The boundaries of where race ends and class, geopolitics, or ethnic, national, and regional conflict begins are of course blurred. There are literally billions of people alive today who've had far more extreme experiences of poverty, brutal law enforcement, and exploitation than I have, simply because of where they were born. So while I critique imperialism, I also acknowledge the contradiction of my own Western privileges, brought about in part, ironically, by my proximity to whiteness. If the Brazilian police had shot me that day, it would certainly have made some level of news. If they shot me now, my being better known would perhaps shine an international light, in the UK at least, on Brazilian police brutality far brighter than the deaths of tens of thousands of Afro-Brazilians. In closing, it is worth asking what the formative race and class experiences of a child born in 2018 into a similar family to mine might be. If current trends continue, for the most part, the answers don't look very positive. They will be even more likely to go to prison than I was, as Britain's incarceration state has expanded greatly during the course of my lifetime. They will probably be far less likely to receive adequate health care as the NHS continues to shrink and or be privatised. The banana skins will almost certainly not return, and the small black middle class is probably now permanent. But the 2018 child will likely have far less chance of lifting themselves out of poverty than I did, as the mechanisms that help make that possible for me continue to be deliberately eroded. On a global level, what might the definitive political struggles that inform the political consciousness of my 2018 equivalent be? Formal apartheid almost certainly cannot return to South Africa, though a civil war that will have racial and ethnic complications still seems entirely possible, and I sincerely doubt that the white farmers newly returned to Zimbabwe will attempt to restore the old pre-1980 undisguised racial order. Having been to Zimbabwe many times myself, I can guarantee black Zimbabweans simply would not stand for it anyhow. But America could quite feasibly be split into ethno-states by extreme violence as empowered white nationalists wish for it to be. Similarly, pogroms against European Muslims, and by ethnic extension, Sikhs and random brown people who look Muslim, as well as continued terrorist attacks by white nationalists and Islamic extremists, and the wider reprisals and discrimination those attacks will be used to justify, seem to me quite likely to be common features of 21st century continental Europe. But, unlike in previous centuries, Europe is unlikely to be able to spill its domestic conflicts out onto Africa, Asia, and the Americas. As you may be able to tell, I am not particularly optimistic about the future, and I hope to be proved spectacularly wrong. I fear the only question for the life of someone like me, born in 2018, is how extreme the tragedies and carnage they will surely live through will be. With that said, as you have surely noticed by now, many victories have been won before, and they will be won again. Formal apartheid fell when it did because of black South African resistance, international pressure, and material assistance from Cuba. The National Front were run out of London by black Caribbeans, South Asians, and an important set of white British allies. British law firms have brought cases against the state on behalf of Kenyans tortured in British concentration camps during the 1950s. And while the scale of the payouts they received was meagre in comparison to the horrors inflicted, the enormity of the British government's lies and deception regarding empire was placed under a critical spotlight by these cases like never before. So my apparent lack of hope is more a recognition that tragedies will inevitably occur, that many of these coming tragedies will be racially charged and stratified by class, but that real people will react in all of the myriad of ways they have done before, which includes reacting by giving birth to new traditions of resistance and creativity and working to create new futures. For children born in 2018 into relative poverty and racialized as non-white, the future seems filled with massive potential for change for the better, brought about by a relative democratization of global and local power. But equally, the possibility of a reassertion and legitimization of extreme forms of bigotry combined with the increased inequality that is affecting everyone. The answers to these questions and the shape of the world children born now will inhabit will be determined not just by politicians and billionaires, but by millions of supposedly ordinary people like you and me who choose whether or not to engage with difficult issues, to try and grasp history, to find their place in it, and who choose whether to act or to do nothing when faced with the mundane and mammoth conflicts of everyday life. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, written and read for you by Akala.